Good morning, folks. This is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. It is Wednesday, November 18th, and we are opening up our Zoom hearing, and we're allowing folks to join us. We'll give folks a little more time to get into the house before we initiate the proceeding with the roll call. So let's give another minute or so. Good to see everyone. All right, it looks like our level of participation is leveled off at about 79, which is great. With that, Hearings Manager Larson, if you would conduct the roll call, please.
Certainly, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Bogue.
Here.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Here.
Commissioner Hackett.
Here.
Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Here.
Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 7 out of 7 commissioners present.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Ms. Larson. And thank you, commissioners, for the attendance this afternoon, as well as the 81 participants that are with us today. We have on our agenda docket number 2006-00115. It is the final part of the mission change rulemaking for the 8, 9, and 12 series. And we have before us this morning, I believe, a presentation by staff on the revised 1200 series rules to acquaint everyone to where we are at in the process. On Monday, we had initial deliberation, and commission provided direction to staff for some potential edits to the draft that had been released on October 9th. We now have before us a November 18th red line draft, and staff is going to walk through that. Before we walk through that, Ms. Larson, is the November 18th draft that was released about 30 minutes ago, is that available to folks on our website?
It is. There's a posting on our main page with a link to the Google Drive where all of the rulemaking documents are housed.
Okay, so would encourage folks to go take a look at that red line. But before you do that, I would encourage you to listen to the staff presentation. Director Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioners, and thanks everybody who's tuned in. I am going to briefly present today. I also made the mistake of volunteering to make this PowerPoint. So 1, it's not pretty. And 2, if there are typos in it, they're mine, not all of these wise technical folks. So to reorient us, the first 2 slides summarize the direction or the commission identified issues that we walked through on Monday. Again, this is kind of just copying and pasting over what we talked through. Starting now, I then took the individual slides on different pieces to walk through the specific recommendations to help keep us oriented. So in 309E, the commission asked that we consider whether we can better integrate threatened and endangered species without designated critical habitat into the consultation process. In response, staff would suggest that the commission consider modifying the language of 309E to to include or an area with a known occurrence. We think that this change represents what CPW district wildlife managers and other staff would know on the ground and would be able to bring into the process without worrying about disclosing confidential information or map layers that weren't quite precise, but it gives the flexibility of what the district managers or what the wildlife personnel know, and make sure that there's a clear process to integrate it into the consultation. So turning next to the directions on Rule 1201, which were focused entirely in the statement of basis and purpose. And I'm going to go ahead and foreshadow that as the slide we finalized on Monday suggests, as part of our as part of the outcome, staff will discuss that response to direction when we talk about Rule 1203. Turning now to Rule 1202C, there was a specific rule direction to revise the Gunnison sage grouse buffer. I went ahead and inserted the SBP note to say that we should also update the statement of basis regarding Gunnison sage grouse buffer to obviously articulate that change, and it would be in response to commission direction and party presentations. So before you now. On this slide, we show the outcome, which would be to revise the regulatory language in Rule 1202C1 from 0.6 miles to 1.0 miles. And then we would include an appropriate discussion in the statement of basis and purpose. Turning now to the other direction from 1202C, which would be to look at the riverscape concept or a technical work group to look at how we can, in my mind, better refine the setbacks or the riparian related protections in reflection of the on the ground value is not quite the right word, but characteristics of the stream or river itself. So I will say that given kind of the breadth and depth of dialogue around the aquatic buffers themselves, we did have our brilliant biologists over at CPW or their team put together a little bit more information about some of the different subcategories in 1202C1 that relate to aquatics. And so I'm gonna, hopefully Danny Newman is in and can unmute, and I'm gonna have her walk through some of the information. And then also somehow their GIS Wizos put together an amazing tool to help us look at what these proposals look like statewide. I think we tried to crash the platform for it, but we got through it. So with that, is Ms. Newman available?
Yes, can you all hear me?
Perfect. Yes.
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you, Chairman, Commissioners. I'm Danny Newman. I'm a land use specialist with CPW in the Northwest region. And I wanted to spend a minute first explaining the source of our stream layers. So NHD stands for the National Hydrography Dataset. USGS produces geospatial datasets for all surface waters of the US. And these are standard layers utilized by natural resource management agencies across the country. They are generally accepted for research and modeling. As we stated before, these systems are highly dynamic, so sometimes they won't fully align with what we're seeing on the landscape, which is why we do hold that intermittent and ephemeral streams should be subject to site-by-site analysis as laid out in the consultation and waiver process proposed. On this slide, you can easily see the stream miles and percent of NHD waters that the proposed rules cover. Gold medal waters are included in sport fish management waters per the draft rules that were posed last week. Can we do the next slide, Julie?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. So now we're, with that context, moving into the map that our GIS department developed. I created a short link, so if you type bit.ly/SB181 waters into your browser, stakeholders and commissioners can view an interactive map of the proposed layers. Julie's loading it now to demonstrate. I lost visual. So hopefully it's coming up for you guys. There we go, perfect. So this map displays native aquatic species conservation waters and sport fish management waters with 300-foot buffers. The cutthroat waters and gold medal waters have a 500-foot buffer, which the commission indicated was a potential outcome of our discussions over the past few days. On this map, you can turn the different layers on and off to see how they overlap or flow into one another. Please note that these buffers are from the center line of the map segments. Ordinary high water mark should be verified on the ground in the field. And let's see, Julie, could you zoom in on the segment just north of Carbondale that we discussed that has gold medal waters? It takes a minute to load. The map will be pixelated at first, but as you zoom in, it'll refine and more detail will show up. So perfect. Maybe if you drag it a little bit, the view a little bit to the left so we can see those green waters a little bit more. Perfect. So this is just one view of many throughout the state where you can see a typical distribution of our aquatic codes. You can see the high elevation cutthroat trout streams to the top right. These feed into native species waters, then into gold medal and sport fish waters, which are the boldest lines on the screen. Oftentimes, our cutthroat and native species waters do not overlap with sport fish or gold medal waters. We thought it would be useful to explain the management intent behind native aquatic species and sport fish management waters to frame the discussion. So the management intent of native aquatic species reflects CPW's determination that those waters are important habitat for native aquatic species and that the agency intends to manage them primarily for those species benefits and protection. While native aquatic species occur throughout Colorado, many individual species have a very limited distribution, either because of habitat loss or due to specialized habitat requirements that limit the number of suitable waters available to them. For example, there are at least 5 native fish presently known to occur in 5 or fewer waters within Colorado, including greenback cutthroat trout. For many species, especially on the eastern plains, they only have intermittent and ephemeral streams in their habitat. Sport fish management waters are primarily managed to provide angler opportunities. Nearly 1.4 million anglers per year participate in recreational fishing in Colorado. Angling is responsible for over $1.9 billion in economic impact annually and over 16,000 jobs in Colorado. Next slide, please. Oh, we're still on the map.
Yeah,
We could go back
do
to the slides.
you want me to go back to slides, Kate?
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thank you. I missed that cue in my notes.
No worries.
So this slide is similar to the first slide where I started speaking, but with a few differences. On this slide, golden medal waters are broken out of sport fish management waters, as the commission indicated that they may consider different protections for sport fish management waters and gold medal waters. If a 500-foot buffer only applies to golden medal waters and cutthroat designated crucial habitat, only a tiny portion of NHD streams in Colorado would be subject to the 500-foot buffer as displayed in this chart. And that's all I had for my aquatic rundown. The next slide will go back to Julie.
Thanks, Ms. Newman. And would you mind, if you can, putting into the chat the actual link to the GIS tool?
Absolutely. It looks a little strange, but if you copy and paste it directly into your browser, it will bring you right to that page.
Excellent. Thank you. And so, again, that was more a little bit of background or context. Now jumping into this bigger question about the technical work group for a riverscape concept or more tailored riparian protections. We spent some time talking with Ms. Newman and her team in particular at CPW about what that could look like. I think that there are a number of different ways that this could be approached, and I think stakeholders have flagged that as well. Given that there's a breadth of options as well as a breadth of resource demands that would be associated with those different options, what staff would suggest is that we take some time to better kind of articulate what those different tools would be, what the outcomes would be, what the workload estimate to actually accomplish it would be, right? And to me, the easiest way to think about that is it's less time intensive to do a desktop review as stream orders as compared to going out and walking an individual stream to evaluate its individual characteristics. We would then release those kind of options and for stakeholder input, criticisms, commendations, other things to think about. We could then finalize the staff's analysis, present it to the commissioners, and then you commissioners can evaluate that information to determine whether additional steps should be taken in this arena, whether we struck the right balance as part of this rulemaking, et cetera. But that to us seemed to be something that we could achieve in in a reasonable amount of time that also would allow you to evaluate how best to address riparian areas going forward. So another quick transition to 1202A and B. We had a couple of recommendations. First, a recommendation to change the West Nile virus requirements that were in 1202B and perhaps move them into 1202A, taking that first. We have made that change. So in essence, 1202B regarding West Nile virus, that language would be moved into a new subpart 9 of 1202A. We did also propose adding a new sentence to the requirement around the action taken to control mosquito larvae. And that would be that such treatment will be conducted in a manner which will not adversely affect aquatic wildlife resources. We heard a little bit of conversation about this on Monday in that spraying to prevent West Nile virus could unintentionally damage other invertebrate populations, and trying to strike the right balance there is important to us. We don't want to do it blindly or without some consideration of that. By moving 1202, the West Nile virus specific requirements into 1202A, it left only one subpart in 1202B, so we folded that into just 1202B as the only statewide or high priority habitat specific operating requirement. That's why you see some odd language or odd redlining in double green underline and also around boring. So wanted to flag why that change would be in the draft rules that people are looking at today. Jumping back to the slide on direction for 1202A and B, there was a request that the commission or that staff clarify in the statement of basis and purpose hazing, its use and applicability. As we looked at this further, one regulatory change we thought we would present to you for consideration is in 1202A8, changing the will in the sentence to may, to clarify that it is a unique tool to be used under appropriate circumstances, and that we would also incorporate proposed SBP language that reflected the comments from Dr. Voltura yesterday regarding implementation of hazing. I know that she's worked up some language. We haven't quite finalized it. I didn't have nearly as much time as I thought I was going to have between Monday and today to actually get finalized SBP language on all these topics, so forgive. Jumping now into 1203. This is where I flagged earlier when we talked about 1201 and the compensatory mitigation reporting out and wildlife impact reporting out. We integrated that kind of into this discussion. And so, and there was also a separate commission direction in the slides for the SBP and definitions to address compensatory mitigation reporting, monitoring, and effectiveness. And so I tried to consolidate all three of those commission directions into this single slide. And I think one of the pieces we want to acknowledge is that some projects, some wildlife projects could provide a net benefit to wildlife, though that's not a mandatory requirement. It's just an acknowledgement that there is a possibility and we have seen it. In addition, we want to consolidate the different facets of wildlife data being gathered and reported out through Rule 903E and ensure that the SBP makes clear that the 904A reporting out about wildlife includes a consideration of compensatory mitigation fees collected and then projects funded in the year, and also the compensatory mitigation plan implementation, compliance, and progress. So I think that captures both aspects of compensatory mitigation that would be approved for as appropriate by this commission. And jumping now, or continuing on 1203, there was a specific request that the staff take a second look at the compensatory mitigation fee and its calculation and structure. And so with that, I would turn it over to Mr. Holst. I'll drive his slides, but he can actually provide the substance.
Thanks, Director Murphy. Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, yeah, so we did take a look at the flat compensatory mitigation fee again and tried to lay out, I guess, some options for you. I think the direction was to maybe peel back some of the assumptions that sort of limited the cost a bit. And so what you see on this slide number 1, option 1 here is essentially our proposal as is, just to refresh your memory. So this is where we did look at the average pad size across Colorado, or the average disturbance associated with an oil and gas location, as we looked at it through Form 2As that were permitted over a period of years. And then we split that disturbance out into the short-term and then the long-term disturbance. And again, for the short-term disturbance, we used our cost to do a habitat improvement, essentially mechanical treatment somewhere to improve the habitat quality without conservation. And then for the long-term, we looked at no sort of treatment, but preserving habitat that's already good quality with a conservation easement. And to get the estimate for that, we looked at the 5 years of DORA conservation easement appraisal value statewide. But we did truncate some of the higher cost conservation easements in Pitkin County to get to the number that we came to there, 5295 as a statewide conservation easement average. So we, as noted in footnote 1 there, if the easement value was over $100,000, we did not include it, $100,000 per acre. Next slide, please. So with this option 2, we essentially, all we did here, it's the same calculation technique. We just included easements that were up to $1 million per acre in Pitkin County. And so we sort of just lifted that ceiling a little bit, and you can see it raised the average conservation easement appraisal value across the state a bit to 69.32. And so that gives a slightly higher fee for that average flat fee for an average well pad size across the state. So it raises it from that 13,800 some odd figure to 17,290 figure. So that would be another option where we sort of raised the ceiling. And essentially just excluded the conservation easement appraisal values that were over $1 million in Pitkin County. Next slide, please. So for this option 3, we sort of changed the methodology a bit. We did away with our treating short-term and long-term disturbance differently, and we just said, okay, what if we basically assume that it is all long-term disturbance, and whether or not we go out and try and mitigate that disturbance with a conservation easement or not, that's how we're going to assess the value of the habitat. And so we just used that long-term conservation easement appraisal value for all 5.82 acres. And that's where we came up with this sort of, again, it would be a flat fee, but of $30,800 per oil and gas location statewide. And so that long-term cost there that we used is again the one that was truncated by eliminating those conservation easement appraisal values over $100,000 per acre. Next slide, please. So for this option, again, same kind of idea. We just did away with sort of our attempt to deal with short-term disturbance. We assumed that it was all long-term, but we, similar to option number 2, we lifted that conservation easement appraisal value ceiling to all of the easements that were under $1 million an acre. And that's where we came up with this figure. So it would be another flat fee figure, higher based on a higher overall statewide average for conservation easement appraisal value. Next slide, please. So for this last one, we basically did away with the idea of a flat fee. That was really put out there, frankly, for ease of administrative purposes. We just thought it would be easier to do a statewide flat fee. This essentially lays out what you could do if the commission wanted to, is a per acre fee. So rather than doing a flat fee based on the average well pad or well location size across the state, as a Form 2A came in, COGCC staff could just look at the number of acres being disturbed because it's disclosed in the Form 2A, and then more or less assign a fee associated with the number of acres disturbed. And so these option 1 through 4 per acre costs there, or estimated mitigation cost, are based on those options 1 through 4 assumptions. So those same assumptions that went into options 1 through 4, but just converted to a per acre fee, to give you an idea of what you could do if you wanted to go on a per acre basis. And I guess the point of that last bullet here is that, a per acre fee would actually likely incentivize reducing surface disturbance. So there is a sort of a policy reason why this might be a good idea. And with that, I'll turn it back to Director Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Holst. And I probably should have said at the outset, but I was just going to try to roll through the different slides, and then we're all available for questions. So I'll close out the discussion of the compensatory mitigation fee piece and jump into some of the other subparts of commission direction that we received on the definitions and SBP. And so this in particular is how other priority species are being addressed through OGDP, and info about how CPW can request consultation. We think that we could include language in the SBP regarding 309. It's on page 6 of the clean version of the SBP. That 309 E2D allows CPW to request consultation and make recommendations, and that this allows CPW to make recommendations for protection of other, i.e. non-high priority habitat species or habitats. So I think that the tool is there. I think as we get through and into guidance, we'll probably have more information about that. If there are specific questions about how how CPW requesting consultation works. I think that's a great conversation or a great question for either Mr. Duranlo or Mr. Holst to talk through the nuts and bolts of that. Going back to the direction slide, there was a request for a clear process diagram for 1202C review. And with that, I would ask Mr. Duranlo to pop up on our screen and talk about the process diagram. We talked some about this Monday.
Thank you, Director Murphy, and thanks for having us again, Commissioners. So this slide is an overview of the general process for a proposed location as it relates to the 1202C high priority habitats and a variance request from those. It's modified from the similar slide that I showed on Monday, and the green boxes here show operator actions. The blue boxes are a COGCC action, and the yellow text indicates extra steps involved for a location that is within high priority habitat and requires a variance request. If an operator determines that it is necessary to pursue an oil and gas development plan with a location proposed in 1202C listed habitat, then the first step should be to reach out to CPW for a pre-consultation. You'll note that I called that optional, though I would encourage operators to say that that's the first step. If the operator and CPW agree that the habitat and the species are not in fact present and are unlikely to return, then the operator can bypass the consultation and the no surface occupancy applicability. This bypass is specified in Rule 309E3C and does not require a waiver or a variance. It's just written concurrence from CPW. If, however, they determine for other reasons it is appropriate to be within the mapped habitat, then the operator will pursue their application with a variance. As they prepare and submit their application materials, they will include with their hearing application in Form 2A a request for a variance per 502C. Once the COGCC determines that the application is complete, the normal consultation process is initiated. At this time, CPW can advise COGCC of their support for the variance, their objections to it, or in either case, recommendations for COAs that would be necessary if the variance were to be approved. COGCC staff will conduct their technical review in consideration of CPW's recommendation, other aspects of the oil and gas development plan, other land managing agency decisions or recommendations, and the overall protection of public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. Based upon that technical review, the director would provide her recommendation to the commission. So far, all of this is the same, whether a variance for any provision of our rules is requested or not. Once in the hands of the commission, however, the only significant difference is that the application would be heard by the full commission in a public hearing rather than having the potential to be decided by a hearings officer or on the consent agenda. And so I think this slide shows that the introduction of a variance request doesn't significantly modify the process or time frame for the application consideration. And now I'll turn it back over to Director Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Duranlo. Let me try to regain control of my slides. Great. So turning now to the specific rule change recommendation from Monday, which was to notice the map rulemaking by January 15th annually. We have included that sentence in the proposed regulatory language in the definition of high priority habitat. Notice of such rulemaking proceeding will be provided by January 15th of each year. Going back to the direction slides, there was a direction in the statement of basis and purpose to look at a biological resources oriented technical work group focused especially on plants. What I would recommend that the commission consider directing staff is to coordinate a work group to evaluate the sources of information about rare plants in particular, how that information could integrate with COGCC permit process review, and also include a consideration of what data is compiled by CNHP, SWAP, and the federal government and others. And again, come back to the commission about recommendations. That of course, oops, sorry, my fingers are getting carried away. That of course would be, put through a work group and receive input from stakeholders as well. that's my intent, to focus on this issue of kind of rare plants in particular. Going back to the direction slide, there was a specific request to include clarification in the statement of basis and purpose about the definition of minimize adverse impacts and why it's different from statute. I asked Ms. Stafford to include a couple of bullet points from her presentation, or AAG Stafford to include a couple of bullet points from her discussion on Monday and staff's closing. And the idea would be to integrate those concepts into the statement of basis and purpose as appropriate. Going back to the direction slide, the compensatory mitigation reporting, monitoring, and effectiveness. Again, that's something that I thought made sense to be integrated kind of wholly with some of the directions in both 1201 and I can't remember the other citation right now. So, but I did talk about it earlier today. How's my brain working as a sieve today? Fairly well, I'd say. And with that's a very, very fast whirlwind roll through, you know, a scattershot of issues. Hopefully it's still fresh enough in everybody's mind that the context, I didn't need to provide more context, but we're happy to take questions, talk about it further, or address further refinements as you all directors see appropriate.
Thank you, Director Murphy. I have a quick question for Mr. Duranlo in his slide about the variance process. Yeah. Oh, hi, Mr. Duranlo. If you're not doing a variance, is that slide still kind of like what you do? I mean, you still go through that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that's very true. I mean, that's, you know, if you are within, let's say you're within a 1202D habitat in the box on the upper left there, we would still encourage that, and our rules still encourage that pre-application consult with CPW, put your Form 2A and oil and gas development plan package together, goes through the completeness review, consultation period, technical review, and recommendation for the commission. I believe the final decision at the commission level can be made by a hearings officer or or on the consent agenda for the commission if there is not a variance request. So that's where in that last box there it is the really significant difference there.
Thank you, Mr. Duranlo.
Thank you.
Before, and we're going to give all commissioners obviously a chance to ask questions. I had something that we either talked about and I didn't make good notes about it, or we didn't talk about it, and I want to make sure that we at least think about it. And this had to do with the sort of the discussion points around biologically significant resources. And I thought that my notes sort of had me putting a smiley face around the stopover and pinch point, even though they're not mapped, as I understand it, that if during a consult or if during an OGDP, one of them is noticed, or you know, we see it, that we would do something about it. And so I just sort of throw that topic out there. I don't know if we did talk about it. I don't know if others share thoughts about that, but you know, I guess I would first look to commissioners to see if this is something you want to talk about. And I'm sorry for bringing something up late in the game. And then if it is something we want to talk about, maybe we could have Mr. Holtz sort of speak to it in terms of the issue and how they would attempt to address it. So I'm looking at my commissioners first. Is there a sort of a thumbs up that this is an okay thing to be talking about? And I don't think we did. So Mr. Holtz, not to throw you on the spot, but can you help us with this topic? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think we did. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, commissioners. Yeah, we did chat about that a bit, and the fact that we don't really have stopover areas and pinch points mapped in Colorado like they have in some other states. I did show you kind of our spaghetti map for that one big deer DAU, White River Herd D7. So yeah, I mean, we do, you know, recognize that those areas are, you know, migration corridors are critical, can't really be mitigated if there is a stopover or a pinch point. So we do understand that. We also talked about the fact that migration in Colorado is generally appears to be kind of different than it is in some of these states where they have mapped stopover points in particular. I will say this, I mean, we have done a fair amount of work with CDOT in the last several years to identify pinch points along highway corridors specifically. And so, there may be something that we could do in that regard in the future, because we are putting a significant amount of effort in with CDOT to really identify the areas where they're actually putting, mitigative structures on the highway. And we do need to keep those, once those crossing structures that are multi-million-dollar kinds of structures are constructed, we do need to keep those sort of free-flowing, if you will, to make sure that we aren't sort of encumbering those with facilities permitted right next to them. But I mean, having said that, I mean, we do have the ability in the current process in 1202D, provided it's a mapped habitat, to evaluate those locations on a site-specific basis, and we would, try and steer facilities away from those kinds of crossing structures and whatnot that we've identified with CDOT. And so I don't have a great answer for you other than to say that that's how we would manage it under the current rules, is we would try and steer development away from those areas, where we know there is sort of a pinch point along a highway corridor.
And
Sure.
go ahead, Director Murphy.
Thanks. I would just follow, given that we're already kind of talking about massaging the SBP on 309 E2D, I think it'd be appropriate to kind of include some discussion of this dialogue on that point, if that's appropriate, as far as commissioners think. And also, to me, this underscores the importance of the frequent map updates as we're proposing to require in the new definition of high priority habitat, with an annual update, right? As if when data around particular pinch points or stopover areas becomes available, it would be appropriate for this commission to consider how to protect those areas more direct through, one of the other provisions within 1202 as compared to letting it be a criteria for consultation.
Mr. Holtz.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I will add on that point, that on Director Murphy's comment there, we are actually working on a statewide map with CDOT to actually map all of the crossing structures in the state. So, I mean, we will actually have some pretty useful information in that regard going forward on those particular types of pinch points.
Well, and I do note, and I think we've talked about this amongst ourselves, that 309 2D sort of has that catch-all for CPW in terms of consult. When you kind of know about something, then you can require the consult. Maybe that and the inclusion in the SBP is enough at this point, given the unmapped pieces of this. But I did want to raise the issue because I didn't cross it off. And again, I did have kind of a smiley face beside it on my notes that this is something that made sense to me and that we should at least acknowledge it for the record. Do other commissioners have thoughts, comments, questions? Commissioner Messmer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is something that Mr. Holst did bring up on Monday, and I had asked a few questions about it. And, one of the questions that I asked specifically that I think is important here is that I do think that there are rules draft rules allow that should CPW in consultation determine that mitigation is not going to be effective, that the option would be avoidance, and so therefore would either be a different site or a denial of the particular referral, a referred denial. And so that response to me made me comfortable until we got to a point where we had better mapping, at which stage I do think it makes some sense to continue to utilize the better mapping on these particular sites in perhaps another rule series, not another rule series, but utilizing 1202C or some other element should these mapped areas be considered to meet that criteria.
Thank you for that, Commissioner Messner. And I think that's further direction to staff that this can be captured in the SBP in terms of denial. And I think that our operators who are participating with us are seeing that the commission finds this to be important, and that they ought to, locate away from these sorts of things, even if they're not mapped. Other commissioners with thoughts, questions, comments, concerns on this particular issue? Great, thank you for allowing me to start off with that piece. Do commissioners have, at this point, we're at the questions for staff piece. So do commissioners have questions or thoughts or comments? Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for the presentation and for walking us through this. I think especially this flow chart on the screen is really helpful just to further clarify some of these processes. I had a question related to the options for the mitigation fees. And I just wanted to ask in particular about the last one. Is the intent here that this would be basically a tiered set of options that come into play based on the particular circumstances of the location? Or if you could just kind of elaborate a little bit further about how this particular option would work in practice.
Commissioner Nanjapa, I'll try Mr. Holson, then you can back clean up, right? Which seems to be how most of the last couple of weeks have gone for me. I think that our idea was to provide for you a number of different options so that you as a commission can decide, do you want a flat fee across the state? And that's what options 1 through 4 were. If you want to switch gears entirely and go for a per acre fee, these are 4 different this is what those 4 options look like as a per acre fee. So it's really, it's almost more of a matrix for you all to consider and make a policy decision on.
Commissioner Nanjapa, follow up?
No, thank you, Director Murphy. I was a little bit distracted by some schoolwork questions, so I didn't totally catch how this one was working. So appreciate that clarification. I think that makes sense. Though I wonder, maybe just as follow-up, was that sort of scenario considered where there are different fees based on different circumstances? Or for example, terrestrial species mitigation versus an aquatic species or aquatic habitat mitigation?
Commissioner Nanjapa, thanks. I think that we took the direction at maybe perhaps too much of face value of figure out how you calculated the first time and tell us how you calculated it and provide us some options. I don't think we thought about kind of recasting it in terms of a either based on specific or impact specific. And I don't know if it'd be helpful to have Mr. Holst kind of walk through the scenario in which compensatory mitigation comes into play, because I think it's one piece of the bigger mitigation pie, if you will. But I'd welcome him to talk about that if that would be helpful. But I don't want to tell you something you already know and understand.
Thank you. No, I think it's, oh, sorry, Mr. Chair.
No.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you. No, I think I understand kind of where you're going with that. And I do understand that this is also in a very narrow set of circumstances that this would even be applied. I just wanted to just better understand if there were, a little bit more sort of conditional situations that were considered. And it sounds like, per your explanation, that it was more just about kind of looking at the fees and the fee structure and whether it was sufficiently encompassing those different scenarios. Is that fair to say?
I think
Director
so.
Murphy?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think so, Commissioner.
Commissioner McGowan.
Mr. Chair, on this same subject, and again, this is not a trick question, I'm guessing there's not an answer. what is the average acreage of disturbance for an operation nowadays? So for me, trying to figure out, I like the idea of it based on acreage to incentivize reducing surface disturbance. And at the same time, I'm looking at, well, if I only disturbed an acre, looking at option one and how we figured out the fee amount based on the average across the state, et cetera, it would only be $2,380 to offset that. So then I was thinking, because I like to complicate things, that maybe there would be a base fee per project with an additional amount for each acreage that beyond 1 acre or something. And maybe I just am living in a fantasy world, but in my view of how much it costs to purchase an acre of land somewhere. So if I'm trying to offset, and maybe I'm misunderstanding this compensatory mitigation fee, maybe because it could be used for something else. It could be used for some other type of project, that I should not equate the cost of how much it costs to buy an acre of land somewhere. And maybe that's what I'm getting stuck around. So if anyone has any kind of thoughts about that, an opinion about that, I would appreciate some feedback.
Holst to Murphy, who wants to go?
Either one. I just want to point out that like we have reclamation rules to deal with the long-term component of impacts, right? And so I just want to me, it's been important throughout the compensatory mitigation fee conversation to keep in mind that this bigger picture component of reclamation is separate and independent, which is why I think this is a much more tailored solution, if you will. And that's why it's not a direct, if you impact 12 acres, we need to buy 12 other acres and mitigate them. Because in the long run, yes, 30 years, whatever it is out, the acres actually proposed to be disturbed will be reclaimed. I feel like I'm totally at the outset of my expertise and would say maybe Mr. Holst, if you want to jump in and save my bacon, that'd be great.
Thank you, Director Murphy, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner McGowan. So, really, the way I think the easiest way to think about this is really we just need a metric to sort of quantify, what we're saying is being lost. And, we use that long-term, for the long-term loss, which we're assuming is the life of the well, which could be 30 plus years. We use that conservation easement appraisal value as that quantification. And we did that because, that's really, essentially you could go out and you could purchase that same quality habitat somewhere else as a conservation easement and say it's being conserved. That doesn't mean that the money would have to be used that way. Just like you mentioned, that money then could be used to do habitat improvements and try and sort of generate some uplift on existing habitat somewhere rather than going out and just preserving habitat quality somewhere else. And so that's, that's sort of built into it. But we used that value because we needed some metric to quantify what was being lost. And so that's why we used that value. So in terms of the average pad size, so when we looked, and so there's several things to keep in mind here. So we actually went back through Form 2As and looked at several years of disturbance area for different pads, and they ranged from 0 to over 25 acres. Very few were over, 15 acres, I would say. The vast majority were under 10 acres. So within that, a substantial number, I would probably say half, were probably under 4 or 5 acres. But the average, because of how it just averaged out, was 5.82 acres. And so there are a lot of pads that are built that are in that sort of mid-range. And I guess the other thing to keep in mind here is our average pad size is probably kind of an underestimate because, very few operators include the access road on their Form 2A. And so although we tried to quantify the access road disturbance where we could, we did not have a lot of information associated with access roads. And so one of the advantages, I guess, of going to a per acre kind of a fee rather than a flat fee for that average pad size is our average pad size is probably an underestimate statewide because we did not have that access road information. it's an underestimate of overall disturbance associated with pads. Make sense?
Commissioner McGowan? Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for providing the options here. I mean, I think it's good to think through these different things and the advantages and disadvantages of each of them. And, you know, I appreciate the per acre consideration as well as some of the, you know, other flat fee considerations. One of the questions I had around the per acre piece is, and actually that consideration of what the average well size is, well pad size is, may or may not include the access road is an important one, I think, as far as determining whether this is a viable option or not. It does seem like there's an initial disturbance, regardless of the size of the pad, is probably outsizes any additional acreage that the pad becomes, right? So, I mean, even if it's a 2 acre disturbance, just being there and making that area less porous for wildlife may be an outsized impact versus, you know, jumping it out another acre. So that's something that's going through my mind, not here nor there. But one of the questions I had, though, is there's some advantages to bigger well pads when it comes to mitigation for noise, mitigation for stormwater stuff. So one of my questions is in encouraging smaller pad sizes, what are some of the, you know, what are some of the things that may be unintended consequences of trying to minimize these surface disturbances in order to minimize the fee that may be paid?
Commissioner Messner, if I may, I think this takes us back to a number of the conversations we had during 2 through 600, and that is that pad size is important, but and minimizing it is a consideration, but not at the expense of safety. And I think we had a number of operators say that safety is their paramount driving force. And so I think that, yes, there's truth in that a per acre mitigation fee can help with an overbuild perhaps, but I don't think it would ever overcome, you know, industry's dedication to safety first.
Chairman, if I may add to that.
Yeah, please, Mr. Dronley.
Yeah, I'd just like to also note that, you know, if an operator was proposing to put 3 smaller pads in instead of 1 larger pad as an attempt to, you know, minimize their mitigation obligations or compensatory mitigation obligations, that would also have to be considered for the indirect impacts piece, where we are actually looking at pad density determinations, and so multiple pads would then, you know, trigger a longer discussion in that aspect.
Thank you, Mr. Dronley. Commissioner Messner.
I've got another question on a different topic if we're ready to move away from this one.
I think Commissioner Gonzalez may have a topic or a question on this topic.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Messner, for passing the torch or passing the baton on that. I'm curious about, so when these are actually, so when they're calculated based on an average per acre basis without regard to the access road. But when we apply the fee, we're going to apply it to the entire disturbed acreage under the 2-way. Do I have that correct on a per acre basis if that's the option we choose?
Mr. Dronley.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I think as we review the Form 2A going forward, it was already our intent to start looking more closely at the inclusion of the access road as disturbed acreage.
I just want to clarify that. I think that's appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Chair, if I can I just want to interject that, you know, I was in the waning minutes before this hearing finalizing this presentation, but we'll get a PDF of it out to commissioners and to stakeholders and parties so that they can have the opportunity to think through this data. I know that we're hitting you with a lot, and we're not here asking for an outcome, just to help inform and your ultimate decisions that are coming hopefully in the next 2 or 3 days.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And I actually had in my notes here, when do we, at some point, commissioners are going to be satisfied with the presentation today. And, the way we built this up, and for all the people that are listening in, there's 108 of them, the stakeholders will have 5 minutes each tomorrow to present to us. And, that's not a ton of time, but I think it is enough time to speak to the important pieces that are on this proposal. So we'll get the proposal out, and we commissioners will look forward to hearing the stakeholder perspectives on these issues tomorrow before we reconvene Friday morning for final deliberations. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have another question. Given that staff itself is a party to these hearings, I'm curious what staff's thought is, and this includes CPW, on what's the necessary number, right? What's the baseline number that we have to achieve in order to protect all the resources we're trying to protect here, and which are more beneficial, more necessary. That's what I'm trying to figure out. I'm trying to capture this in a necessity baseline and necessity framework.
Chair, if I may.
Director Murphy.
Thanks. Thank you for the question, Commissioner. I think it's a good way to frame a question that I'm not sure I've approached correctly over the last 11 months analytically, which is, what do we think is an appropriate number? We wanted to provide the fee as an option, but not as the only option when it comes to addressing compensatory mitigation. And so as we're trying to build out a fee that we thought was fair and reasonable, we looked, as Mr. Holst said, to kind of these other sources of information and aggregated that across the state, excluding a couple of pretty big numbers, to come up with something that felt administratively appropriate. I think that there's probably, we've heard a lot from parties about increasing, decreasing, appropriate, inappropriate, and a lot of concern about the fee in and of itself. And so I think we've tried to present, at least today, different options that can help, that can reflect different sets of analyses that went into it. But again, we've really been thinking about it from a, what do we think is appropriate based on the breadth of the data that is out there on fees, and what feels administratively appropriate, given that we're looking at this limited issue of compensatory mitigation.
Thank you, Director Murphy. Other questions on the compensatory mitigation piece? If not, I believe Commissioner Messner has the floor on a next topic. Go ahead, Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did have a question about the variance flow chart, and I think there was some discussion on Monday regarding the ability for an operator, should they choose to be able to hold a variance hearing prior to submittal of the full OGDP. Is that true? And how does that fit into this flow chart?
Mr. Duranlo?
Sure. So that's not the way we have interpreted the flow of the rules. That there would be sort of a pre-application hearing to determine whether or not the variance would be approved. And so you can see that the variance is requested at the beginning of the process and heard at the end of the process. I mean, with respect to timing on this, presumably, in that pre-consultation, the kinks are sort of worked out of the process between the operator and CPW. And if CPW supports the variance, then the consultation period listed there in green in the middle of the page, could be pretty quick if the operator has gotten concurrence with CPW. We have a 60-day consultation timeframe with to consider all the wildlife information and input from other stakeholders, federal land management agencies, et cetera. And we feel that that's sufficient time to address that variance request and then take a recommendation to the commission. So we didn't propose to include a sort of separate process for, to consider the variance early.
Okay.
Commissioner Messmer.
No, I appreciate that. I was just trying to make sure I understood if the operator had options there or whether, as built in the rules, there was really just an option. And so it sounds like there's just an option. And so let me ask this question based on that. And this is probably a question for CPW staff, because one of the concerns that I shared on Monday was whether or not CPW staff who may be reviewing this, this particular site in a pre-application consultation would have enough information necessary in order to be able to, give an initial thumbs up or thumbs down before it went into the process, and whether we needed to build in any directive that would require an operator to provide a certain baseline amount of information to CPW in order for them to be able to properly consult on this. And maybe they've already built an application up enough in order to be able, a draft application with an ALA in order to be able to initially do that. But none of this seems to be explicit. And so I guess I was just wondering from CPW whether they felt like they had whether they were confident that they had the ability to ask for enough information in order to be able to make an informed draft recommendation.
Mr. Holst.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Messner. So, I kind of see this as, we work and have gotten to know most operators pretty well. And so, I think what we would do is initially give the operator our feedback as to whether or not we thought a variance would be, possible in that specific circumstance. And frankly, what would be required to sort of build the record into the OGDP as to, make it through the commission for a variance. So I kind of see us sort of helping the operator kind of line out what they need to put into the record to make a variance possible, or, giving them, if we don't think it's, a likely variance. So I do think that, while some operators will come in with a bunch of information on why a variance is appropriate, some won't. And I think for those cases where they don't, I think we would then give them an assessment of what we think they would need, or if we even think a variance would be possible. So I kind of see us working sort of through that with the operator rather than just sort of making a determination like on the spot. I think it would be sort of I don't want to say a partnership, but, frankly, it would be kind of us working through it with them.
Commissioner
Chairman.
Messmer. Oh, Mr. Dorla, do you want to add?
Yeah, I'm sorry. May I just add to that? I think that's one of staff's considerations as well as to why we're a little bit anchored, if you will, in what you see on the screen here, because in our evaluation of the variance request, we may be considering more than just wildlife, right? And so we want to be able to look at the entire package. We want to be able to consider what the federal land managers have said, the local government may have said about it, and certainly the CPW evaluation is critical with respect to wildlife, but there's more to the application than just the wildlife consideration. And so I think that's why taking CPW's recommendation, and if their recommendation, they're supporting the variance request, barring something, pretty drastic, I wouldn't see staff, going against that recommendation. And so I think it does make sense to run it through this entire process.
And in the process, there's really two stages for CPW consultation, right? So you've got the initial pre-application one where they're saying, yeah, you could probably get it if you did these things, or man, there's no way that you're going to get this. Don't even try.
Right. And they may suggest some things for the operator to bring forward in their application, right? Like, you should do something to address this aspect. And then the operator, goes through their machinations to figure out how they're going to address that specific issue and brings forward in their variance request a very detailed plan to address an issue.
And then at that stage, once the application has been deemed complete and it goes through the review process and we go through the formal variance process, then as part of reviewing the OGDP, CPW consults a second time on the full application with the full amount of information available to them in order to make a formal recommendation. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Thanks.
Commissioner Gonzalez, did you have a question along these lines?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I kind of want to piggyback on Commissioner Messer's kind of first part of the question about the order of the variance request. And I understand how it's mapped out here. And when I think about it, after our discussions this week, this is kind of how I view kind of the more efficient way of doing it. However, I've considered a couple other things, specifically with regard to federal permitting, where that process takes a lot longer, and the BLM has a lot of input in citing in that regard. And I'd be curious if the rules as drafted contemplate or allow for or would work in a situation where someone applied for a standalone 1202C variance without an OGDP, just to see if they're going to get it, to see if that's going to be their starting point for their long permitting process with the BLM, so they don't go through this process and then get BLM approves the site with an on-site, and then we're saying no, and they're kind of stuck in that limbo.
Director Murphy?
Chair, I think, and when we walk through the rules on this on Monday, I think it's clear that possibility is allowable under the rules. I think it would be, from a pragmatic side, I think it would be hard to consider that in isolation, because you as commissioners wouldn't have the benefit of what are the other tools available. Why is this necessary in this circumstance? But I continue to think that a variance gives you the flexibility needed in the context of, for example, a federal decision in particular to make a decision about siding with an NSO.
Commissioner Gonzalez, that was the point I made on Monday, is that I think as drafted, our variance rule is flexible enough that if there is a particular instance where an operator thinks that's the appropriate course to go, I think they've got a legal right to ask it on its own. I think what we're hearing from staff is, generally speaking, that's not going to be favorable, but I think these things would shake their way out, and I think there's enough flexibility from my reading of the rule to allow for what you've just asked.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I kind of read it the same way, and that's kind of how I originally contemplated it before our discussions earlier this week. And so I just kind of wanted to set that out and make sure that we all understand that is an option. If someone wanted to have a limited hearing on just whether or not a site, without regard to all the other considerations of an OGDP, would be available, appropriate, protective within one of the buffers that they're seeking to be varied from, if you will. So I think I've got that option, that is an option. I understand that is an option. So,
Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can I ask a bigger overarching question about what our purpose is today? I think, to me, this is a series where we've been kind of maybe less focused and having a little less clarity about what we want and throwing things at staff, and then they've put a bunch of things for us to consider. Are we trying to hone into this afternoon so that there's something more specific for parties to respond back to us tomorrow? Or are we leaving this open-ended? And is there still space for discussion for, I think I'm not done with this whole concept of just a variance for the setbacks, and I've been really thinking about it on the last couple of days. And I just want to know where there's space to have that conversation. Kind of what is our overarching goal in our conversation today? I'm sorry if it's not really clear to me. Sorry.
I think that's a worthy point. I was kind of wanted to make the same statement, because in my mind, variance and some of these other setbacks decisions sort of play in hand with each other a little bit. And so I too was wondering, what the commission's thoughts are. And I think it really is up to us in terms of what we want to do. I'm looking at Director Murphy to see if she's got some thoughts about this topic.
Sure. And commissioners, I'll start with kind of what we've done historically for the other rule series is parties complete their presentations and closing statements, staff provides its closing remarks, and then we get direction from you about go change these particular rule provisions, go implement these things. And to me, that from Monday was very clear, except for maybe on one point in terms of where you knew where you wanted to see changes from staff. The one point that we really left open, and I think you specifically solicited more feedback from parties, is on the question of the aquatic NSO setback, right? We talked about a number of different options. And then kind of as a tangential piece, which is overlaps with aquatic habitats, but is also bigger than aquatic habitats, is the question of the variance versus an exception process. And staff, continues to think that a variance, even if modified, consistent with the commission discussion on Monday, makes the most sense in that space. But I think today we wanted to make sure you heard where we are at on a number of these pieces. A lot of them are not rule related, right? There's a lot of statement of basis and purpose changes, or like kind of, and to let you all think about how we have thought about those comments. And then as you hear from parties tomorrow, and as we get to Friday, if you want to add additional clarity around the statement of basis and purpose, provide better refinements to, for example, the technical work groups that I've laid out, we will be prepared to take that input from you, whether it's today or Friday. But I think you're right, Commissioner McGowan. Today was for staff to kind of regurgitate back our responses based on what we heard on Monday, and then to let you digest them, hear from the parties, digest that information further, and then Friday morning we come back together to make some more final decisions on what has been presented and what parties have discussed. So does that help at all? No.
Commissioner McGowan.
Sorry. So I have two thoughts. One is, where is it appropriate for me to say, I have another idea I want to put on the table and I would like feedback about it from my fellow commissioners as well as parties? And two, I do feel like in the other series, we've been a little more focused on what we put out and back for feedback. So like the mitigation fee, for example, still feels to me kind of all over the place. And do we want to try to, and maybe we don't, maybe we just want to leave it open and ask people for feedback on that whole series of things, or do we want to try to focus it in a little bit so the parties have something more specific to respond to and say, this makes it better, or this is a lot worse, or this series just seems more open to me, and maybe that's okay. As far as what we're putting back out after hearing from the parties, us contemplating and asking staff to put something together, there seems to be a lot of still kind of open-endedness. So I guess I have two questions there.
Chair.
Director Murphy.
I think, Commissioner McGowan, the earlier that you can start thinking out loud about ideas with your commissioners, the better it is for all of us, because it gives us a chance to think about what that regulatory language looks like. If it ends up, becoming a more specific direction from the commission, it lets parties respond to it more directly. So I think today would be a good day to do any of those things. And I do think you're right on those three topics. To me, it's variance, exception for 1202C. It's what is the aquatic buffer for the aquatic habitats, and the third one is what is the direct fee. I think those are a bit more open-ended. I do think your other directions to us were more consistent with 2 through 6 and pretty, here's what we want, go do it. So.
Commissioner Messner, do you want to weigh in?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is just my opinion, but I do think we need to make some decisions today, at least in a draft format, for review and comment by the parties on the three things that Ms. Murphy just indicated. So the variance process versus the waiver, the aquatic setbacks, and the compensatory mitigation fee. And I think that it would be worthwhile to get more specific. Otherwise, as a party person, if I was one of the parties, I'm not even sure what I would be commenting on some of those things, because I've only got a limited amount of time and there's like 3 or 4 different options on the table for some of those. And so I'd like to see us narrow it down a little bit.
Commissioner Messner, I tend to agree with a caveat. I do want to hear from the parties. We've got, for instance, on the aquatic setbacks, there are 3 or 4 different options there, and we could probably create 6 or 7. And if we narrow it down to one, I don't want myself. I don't, if I were to vote one way today, I would be hedging to everybody that I want to hear from the parties about it. And that may be influential in terms of where I find myself on Friday. So I guess I agree we should have discussion, but I do not want to discount the afternoon we're going to have tomorrow where we hear from parties about the various options that we've talked about. The same thing goes with variance versus exception. And if it's variance, is it variance with 1 or 2 of those provisions in or out or not, et cetera. So that's just my 2 cents on that. Commissioner Najapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I generally tend to agree, and especially around the way that you just framed it. I think if we could go back to the direction we provided to staff on a couple of those issues and tweak and clarify there, especially where we don't have specific red lines in this updated draft, and be able to offer some additional ideas, as Commissioner McGowan was saying, that the parties can react to. But yeah, I also agree. I don't want to get us too. I do want to narrow, but I don't want to get us all the way down to this is what I'm thinking, and then prove me wrong sort of situation.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do appreciate those comments. I would point out that that's kind of the way we did it before, is that we narrowed it down to a point where we actually had a draft that people were reacting to. And in some of those instances, we changed our mind in the final deliberation based on feedback that we received. And I'm not suggesting that any kind of narrowing that we do today would necessarily be the final decision either, because we would have party presentations and we certainly have the right to pivot before the final vote. So
Others with thoughts? Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, and I appreciate all the discussion around this. I was having the same thoughts as we kind of got into some more of the meat of the discussion. They kind of moved on to different topics. I do think that some of these topics deserve just a bit more discussion, at the very least, to signpost to the parties what we're thinking, what we're concerned about. I, for one, that sounds like, along with my fellow commissioners, don't plan on making up my mind about anything until Friday. So I look forward to being influenced by the party presentations and by deliberations of my fellow commissioners. So that's where I stand. I feel like we're all kind of in the same place, kind of. So I'm with the suggestion that we hone it down a little bit, but still leave it open-ended for enough discussion and ideas to flow, not only from us today, but from parties on tomorrow afternoon.
Well, with that, maybe I can take a shot at just sort of thinking about the aquatic buffer and the variance or exception piece, because as I mentioned, some of that in my mind is, Commissioner Najapa, did you want to weigh in?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted to, I did have one more question for staff. So before we kind of got into more of a deliberative mode, I'm
Absolutely.
not sure if I'm fine going back and forth, but I also want to sort of get staff more off the hook if we can, while we start wrestling with a couple of these things.
Please, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So just one thing, a couple things I just wanted to get a little bit more clarification is, I appreciated in the red lines the addition of the additional language in 309 around areas of known occurrence, when a federally T&E species is not, when critical habitat is not mapped. I was just wondering if I could get a little bit more clarity on when and how Fish and Wildlife Service is consulted by CPW, and also just, I think I know the answer, but, I would think that CPW is already working closely with Fish and Wildlife Service on these various T&E species, especially where they have jurisdiction. But again, kind of thinking about these T&E plants, when would be the instance that we might call in Fish and Wildlife Service to sort of help out with understanding where there might be an impact?
Director Murphy?
Thanks. I'll take the first cut and then turn it over to our partners at CPW who actually do the consultation. But T&E species is a mandatory consultation, first and foremost. And so with that, Mr. Holst, I don't know if you're the right lucky chosen person or not, but you're the first person I see.
Mr. Holst?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Najapa. So, if we do have, like we mentioned, in our database, if we do have a locality of a T&E, then we would bring that up, and as part of that, we contact Fish and Wildlife Service because it really is their jurisdiction. They have primary authority over those federally listed T&E species. They do rely on us in a lot of circumstances, and the example I'll give you is for Gunnison sage-grouse, for example. They define critical habitat to have certain constituent elements to it. And so when we have a well that's proposed in the sort of exterior boundary of what they've mapped as critical habitat, or even previously occupied habitat, sometimes they'll basically contact us and ask us to go out and look to see if those constituent elements are present. And so we actually go out and look at the well location as part of our on-site and try and make that determination for them. In a way, we sort of coordinate with them on those kind of aspects. So, it would come up in a variety of ways. I mean, in some cases, Fish and Wildlife may contact us. In most cases, we would likely be the ones that would contact them. And we share the same data. And so Fish and Wildlife Service really doesn't have occurrence data. I don't believe that we don't have. So we generally share the same kind of occurrence data.
Thank you, Mr. Holst. And I knew it was a mandatory consultation, and I would imagine that's true, but specifically for wildlife, is that correct? Not for the T&E plant species?
That's correct.
Meaning that I know the T&E plant species might be part of a consultation, but how do we determine, that there is a potential situation where a T&E plant species might be involved?
Mr. Holst?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So for T&E plants, if it were on any of our properties or on federal lands, that would come up as part of the process. If it's on private lands, we would not, as CPW, typically do a review of T&E plants on private lands. If we know of one, as part of our just normal, what we have kind of in our regional kind of knowledge base, we would probably bring that up. But I mean, we don't typically do that screen for T&E plants. It's just a little bit outside of our bailiwick.
And Commissioner Najapa, that's one of the pieces that I wanted to make sure we integrate into that question about biological resources and rare plants in particular is recognizing how should we be addressing it?
Commissioner Najapa?
Thank you very much, both Mr. Holst and Director Murphy. I think that was the part of it. I just wanted to better sort of tease out, there's the mandatory consultation, but we're really only looking for the wildlife species where there is, we need to figure out, or that piece of it, the plant species, is where it fits in more in the biological resource. I just wanted to better, make sure that was clear in my head and kind of how it is currently working and where, where the current rules apply and where the work group situation, the biological resources component comes into play. So thank you. I think that helps me with that. I did have one other question, unless any of my fellow commissioners had follow-ups on that topic.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
I have a question about just the 309 edition in general, and it's basically what's a known occurrence. I'm trying to think: is it something that's documented? Is it constructive knowledge, actual knowledge, whose knowledge? That's a question I had in the new language.
Director Murphy.
Chair, I may turn that over to Mr. Holst or the team at CPW, given they're the entity that houses that knowledge.
Mr. Holtz?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Gonzalez. So it would be kind of both. I mean, typically, if we do have sort of a known locality, it is documented, and that information is transmitted to Fish and Wildlife Service. In some cases, the local jurisdiction may know us about something that we don't know, and so they could bring it up. In some cases, some of our staff may know. And so it's a little bit of a combination of both. I guess it would be documented. It's just a matter of kind of where it's documented.
I'm not seeing further questions on this topic. Therefore, Commissioner Nanjapa, I believe you have the floor for a different topic.
Yes, thank you very much. Just a quick clarification here on was related to the red lines in 1202B. Actually, sorry, 1202C. When there's the additional, the red line text of installing culverts or bridges, et cetera, I'm assuming this is all part of the consultation and or guidance that's provided to the operators in terms of what may be appropriate to use in the particular situation. Is that correct?
Commissioner Nanjapa, you're talking 1202C. Well, sorry. I'm lost in my own rules right now.
I think it may be referring actually to 1202B.
Yeah, it shows a C there in the margin, but you're right. I think it is technically 1202B1. Sorry. But it's that additional piece about operators boring rather than trenching. And then the last sentence that's in green. Yeah, so that was the piece. I just wanted to make sure that in those instances where there may have to be culverts or bridges or et cetera installed, is that part of the consultation that CPW would recommend a particular type of structure or provide guidance or recommendations in that instance? Is that correct?
Yeah, Chairman, if I may.
Yep.
Yes, we would absolutely expect that CPW's aquatic staff would weigh in on that consultation and make recommendations, or identify if a crossing was inappropriately placed or inappropriately sized or inappropriately designed or something like that.
Commissioner Nanjapa, follow up? Okay.
Thank you. I'm good.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got a question on a different topic, and it's a question that I asked yesterday, but I'm not, because I think that we're going to be considering a potential option that would utilize the classification of gold medal waters. I want to hone a little deeper on that. So I got a couple of questions around that, because I know that there's a certain criteria to become a gold medal water. I think it was also talked about yesterday that there are certain stretches of stream within Colorado that are pretty darn close to gold medal water and probably have near identical characteristics. So what is CPW's process of updating those gold medal waters in order to ensure that we're providing the level of protection necessary to any stream that isn't currently designated gold medal waters, but may have characteristics that are substantially equivalent to gold medal waters? Because I'm not sure that in the development of the term gold medal waters, which is probably more of a marketing tool than a land use planning tool, it was considered to be utilized in perhaps this regulatory setting. So that's my question.
Mr. Ackerman, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Messner. Again, Brett Ackerman, Southeast Regional Manager. And actually, I believe we're elevating Josh Nearing, our Southeast Senior Aquatic Biologist, and he can help us get a little bit more into the detail. But in the end, as we're elevating him, I would just remind the group here that Generally, the criteria are 60 pounds of fish per acre, and then a certain number of 14 plus, and he can help us get there. Looks like he's not quite there yet.
He's in the panel now. There we go. Mr. Nearing.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, and thank you for the question. Again, apologize for yesterday. I didn't introduce myself. My name is Josh Nearing. I'm the Southeast Senior Aquatic Biologist, and yeah, I appreciate the question on the gold medal waters. As I said yesterday or the other day, we do have a few waters that kind of teeter on that brink of becoming gold medal, but you do have to, we have to meet that threshold of 60 pounds per acre or 12 fish over 14 inches per acre. And so they kind of teeter there, and we need to meet that consistently over 4 or 5 years. What I would say, it's not really very common that we move those waters up, but it's a pretty hard threshold to meet, especially the 12 fish over 14 inches. The 60 pounds per acre, we have quite a few waters that do meet that, but the more difficult threshold is that 12 fish per acre, or 12 fish per acre over 14 inches. And so, you know, we monitor those quite regularly. The gold medal waters get a little more monitoring, I would say, but we would go through the process of making sure it's meeting that criteria, and then ask the commission to consider adding it to the gold medal waters. The other thing I would say is these gold medal waters really, a lot of times if there's a section of stream that's gold medal, just outside of that is I would say it's got to be almost solely sport fish management waters. So there's added protections around those gold medal waters. If it's, you know, if we have 500-foot buffer for the gold medal, 300 for the sport fish management, you would see that buffer shrink a little bit, but there are protections in place for those quality waters. Does that get at your question, Commissioner Messner?
No, that's good, and I appreciate that. I think one of my questions is because we may be considering utilizing that term gold medal waters and the characteristics of it, you know, in a regulatory fashion. These streams that, you know, aren't currently gold medal waters but may be close, will they get potentially additional analysis on an annual basis to determine if they cross that threshold at some point so that they would see those additional protections?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you for the question, Commissioner. Typically, you know, those waters that are bordering gold medal do get sampling, I would say in most instances, probably on an annual basis, if not every 2 or 3 years. And so we're monitoring those waters quite closely. And especially if there's things that we are changing or that other groups or entities are changing as far as habitat conditions, that would certainly pique our interest to want to go out and monitor that a little more closely. It's not very common, like I said, that those waters would go to gold medal. I don't even think it's every year that we would nominate one. And then on the other side of things, once it drops below those levels and below those criteria, there's also a process for delisting those. And we've had that happen on a couple places across the state. So it's, you know, if it's meeting that criteria consistently, then it'll stay on there. But if it drops for some reason, be it disease or degraded habitat, things like that, it may drop below. The other thing I would add there is fires obviously impact fisheries. and can have devastating effects on gold medal. And in my southeast, in the Arkansas, is one of the waters that we monitor. We've had that happen. We haven't immediately pulled it off that list because we know it's going to recover. It's just going to take a couple of years for that watershed to heal and then get back, put back on the list. So it's not really on off jumping around a lot, but we do monitor those waters. They're bordering gold medal quite regularly.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I got one more question, and this is just to make sure that I'm better informed. But understanding that potential outside impacts could affect a fishery, is it feasible that potential impacts from any source, whether it be oil and gas or any other potential impacts, subdivisions, human impacts, could preclude a stretch of stream from ever becoming gold medal, even though it may, have some of those characteristics, right? So, I mean, my point is it possible to not have it classified right now as gold medal, but it's darn close, but because we are potentially citing things closer than we would with a gold medal stretch, that it will never actually meet that gold river level medal stretch in the future?
Thank you for the question, Commissioner. I guess I would say with that, I think with the added protections that you're considering with the buffers, I would hope that we wouldn't see that. If there are instances where well pads or things come into or encroach on that buffer, hopefully we'll be able to mitigate those impacts appropriately so that we wouldn't see those sorts of effects. Most of our gold medal waters are river systems that have quite a length of stream as well. And typically we sample those streams at multiple locations along the gold medal waters. And so I would hope that, any impact could either be mitigated or wouldn't have a drastic effect on gold medal. But I can't say that that's not a possibility either.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. That's good information.
Commissioner Messner, just along these lines, I Googled the Colorado Gold Medal Rivers map, and best I can tell, the North Platte and the Colorado rivers appear to be in active oil and gas fields. Most of the others do not appear, the Animas, but our wells down here in Southwest Colorado are not along the Animas, from my knowledge. So I don't know if that adds any value or not, and I don't know if this map is accurate. It's not on the CPW website. It's on coloradofishing.net. Other questions for commissioners? All right, so I think that we wanted to maybe attempt to frame the issues around variance, waiver, aquatic buffer, and the fee at a minimum. And some of us may want to further, think about, where they're at on those. And some of us are sort of wanting to hear from operators. But the fee piece was in the slides, but the variance exception and the aquatic buffers didn't really find its way into the slides or the red line, because right now the aquatic buffers are just at what staff proposed. Let me take an initial punt at framing that, and then commissioners can weigh in and we can see how much we want to discuss versus how much we want to set it out there so that parties can then provide perspective on that tomorrow. But as I see the aquatic buffer, we've got the staff proposal of 500 feet, right? And then we've got the option B, which I sort of floated, which was 300 to native and sport fish and 500 to gold medal and cutthroat. And then I know there was somewhat more of a sliding option of 500, maybe soft and then 300 hard, and maybe doing something between the two if you do VMPs or otherwise protective. And I would turn to Commissioner Nanjapa and maybe Commissioner McGowan to help flesh that out. But that would be sort of option C on the aquatic piece. Am I even close to commissioners think? Are there options D, E, and F that I'm not thinking about? Do Commissioners McGowan and or Nanjapa or anyone want to help flesh out option C? Just trying to get it framed so that our staff and the public can appropriately respond tomorrow. Commissioner McGowan, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I've been thinking a lot about these concepts over the past couple of days, and I think I have an option C, varied. Let me kind of go through my thought process, so you all can see what you think or shoot it down. So I've been thinking about the other series that we've gone through and the tools that we've used when we have what I'm going to call a blunt instrument that is meant to be protective, but sometimes we recognize that it doesn't provide an opportunity for special circumstances, and we know that sometimes special circumstances exist, or that there are other options that might be viable. And so I've been thinking about the variance, the waiver, and the exception. Those are some of the tools that we've been using. I actually think the variance should stay as is, and it should apply to any of the rules that the commission has, because that's how we contemplated in the 500 series. Your ability to say I am different is the variance. That is the tool is the variance. And I think if we create a special different kind of variance for wildlife habitat, it's confusing that we have this type of variance for all of our rules, except when we're talking about wildlife, there's a different variance that might be applied. Because I know for a while we talked about we could use the variance, but we wouldn't apply some of the variance things that are in the 500 series. And I'm not a fan of that personally. I think that some of the tools we've used in the other series, so with the pits, for example, we said we're not a fan of pits, but we get that some pits, not all pits are created equal. And for all of you creating new pits, we're going to require some sort of best management practices and require certain technologies. And I think that's creative, and I think it allows for some flexibility and acknowledges that not all pits are equal, for example. I think that in the 600 series, we were pretty clear that the 2,000 feet, we're serious. We don't want you building things within 2,000 feet of populated areas, but we also then created the off-ramps, the exceptions, right? Where we said there are some special snowflake circumstances and provide some off-ramps for you to choose a different path and to show us why you might merit being closer than 2,000 feet to a populated area. I'm generalizing things, sorry, because this is what I've been thinking about. And so I'm going to put out there, I think that there's been a lot of testimony, and I think we could carve out how this goes 101 ways, and there's enough evidence in the testimony or that's been submitted for the studies that we could cut it 500 ways, and all of them would be appropriate and supported by what has been shared with us through this rulemaking process. That being said, I am supportive of a 500-foot buffer for all the aquatic species, with the kind of the caveat of how we viewed the 600 series and the 2,000 foot. There needs to be a waiver or an off ramp as far as I'm concerned, because I think there are circumstances. I feel like the 500 feet should be a hard setback for the gold medal waters and the cutthroat trout. I think those are like the best of the best, and we should try our best to protect those and protect them from spills and other incidences from oil and gas development. I would be supportive, however, of a waiver process for anything between 300 and 500 feet. And then I'm revisiting our 400 series, where we created different buffer zones around public water systems, where we acknowledge that if you're in the intermediate buffer zone, for example, you have to implement some best management strategies so that we are preventing anything leaking or seeping into a public water system. And I would be supportive if you were applying for that waiver between 300 and 500 feet, that the same requirements that we have for the 411 series for the intermediate zone would apply to operations between the 300 and 500 feet. And I know this is sounding convoluted. And then I'm going to add the caveat that if CPW looks at the waiver and there's a special circumstance, they could add conditions of approval, or they could not deny the waiver request to do something within the 300 to 500 foot buffer. That's kind of what I've been contemplating. And if folks thinks it's awful, I get it. But I think we allow, then we're protecting what I think through what I read and through testimony, the best of the best waters that we had, the 500 foot setback for the cutthroat and the gold medal. But we're allowing some flexibility for the other streams at 300 feet, which was the current waiver. But we're saying if you're going to do that, you've got to do things that are more protective. And there might be more to this conversation. Is the 500 foot the final setback for the creme de la creme of our aquatic habitat species? I don't know. But this was kind of what I've been thinking about.
Commissioner McGowan, can I ask a question? The last piece, I don't know that I followed that as much. I understand the if between 3 and 5, then we would have the toolbox from 411 intermediate zone applicable. But then you said CPW could still deny the waiver for a 300 to 500 if special circumstances. And I'm trying to get that.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think in the conversations from what I've heard, not everything is mapped appropriately. And so I'm a little concerned that maybe a water that we think is one type or another hasn't been mapped appropriately, or not in, or CPW needs more information about the habitat. And so I felt like what we heard from industry is that they were comfortable if CPW had to deny something as they went through a waiver process. So I want that, as if an operator wants to apply for a waiver, if there's some special circumstance and CPW can explain what that is, that they could recommend denial to the commission, or they could recommend some additional conditions of approval beyond those 411 intermediate buffer zone conditions. And the BMPs for 411, if I'm remembering correctly, are lined burns. Your liquids have to be in tanks. There's regular visitation to the site. You have to have emergency equipment on site while you're drilling. If there's 5 of them.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much, Commissioner McGowan. I was looking back both at the conversations that we had around the variance and how we handled some of these previous rules as well, and was kind of coming to a very similar set of thoughts. And what I was sort of proposing, and you know, the other day was the idea, as we sort of adopted with our 604 setbacks, of a hard line at 300, but saying that, you know, 500 is our preference. So kind of like we have 2,000 is our preference for the setbacks in 604, but we're allowing, you know, some leeway in that 500 to 2,000 space. So similarly here in the 300 to 500 space, you know, I was thinking that, and I'm thinking especially that it kind of in the way that you've been referring to, you know, these special circumstances as, you know, these special snowflakes. I mean, these are our really unique and special sensitive habitats. We've talked a lot about how there's additional difficulty in mitigating or recreating or even restoring in some instances, and so I think there's yeah, I think that's kind of along the lines of what I was thinking is, can we have a harder NSO maybe allow for certain types of flexibility in certain circumstances, but with those kinds of best management practices. And yeah, I was looking at those 400 series restrictions that we have. We also already have, as Director Murphy pointed out in her presentation, you know, the instances when a location is upstream from riparian or wetland habitats. So we already have some of those provisions as well. And so I like kind of creating that additional consistency among our rules in that way. All of that said, I also see, you know, with the flow chart, the value in keeping them all at 500 for that idea of avoidance, and allowing for the variance, you know, to go through the process. I think the only thing that I still remain a little bit uncomfortable with just the way that it's proposed in a simple variance, or, you know, not that a variance is simple, is that we don't have a harder NSO. So that's where I am still thinking of some sort of hybrid of what is currently proposed, but a hard NSO that you can't go less than.
Commissioner Messner, then Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner McGowan, for you know, continuing to think out of the box and coming up with ideas, and, you know, having the courage to present those and work through them. And I really do appreciate that. So I'm going to also do a little bit of a train of thought here, because I mean, I hear what you're saying and I appreciate it, but I've also done, you know, a little bit of thinking over the last couple of days about appropriate ways forward here and what really we're trying to accomplish, and you know, why the draft rules were proposed the way that they were by the professionals that have been working on this, and you know, and whether or not there are off ramps and opportunities and waivers for the different things that we're talking about here. And what continued to kind of jump into my mind is that, you know, I think that what we're hearing from our partners at CPW is the best way to protect these particular species, the aquatic species and the terrestrial species, is avoidance. And that's the way that we protect these species. And there's no other great way to protect them or mitigate for impacts to them other than to avoid them. And so I'm taking that very personally, because I do think that that's important, that folks are saying that avoidance is the most important way to protect these particular species. Now, having said that, you know, I do think that, you know, Rule 1202C, you know, does allow for a lot of consultation with biologists and professionals and experts in the fields. You know, it doesn't not only preclude consultation, as some have indicated, but it actually encourages that consultation. I think that 1202C, you know, provides clear exceptions for road access and flow line and utility and corridor installation, you know, in these NSOs, particularly the aquatic NSOs. Rule 1202C provides potential waivers for intermittent and ephemeral streams in these areas where the mapping may or may not be completely accurate, or there needs to be additional ground truthing to determine whether it's appropriate to have these setbacks, you know, apply to these certain intermittent or ephemeral streams. You know, Rule 1202C provides opportunities for ground truthing in all instances. You know, the 1202C provides opportunities for the variances based on that ground truthing. 2 different opportunities for consultation, pre-consultation and consultation on the variance itself, and the development and input of, you know, scientific expertise and evidence in that variance process. You know, I think 1202C, by the way of 309E3C, provides waivers for sites that are based on ground truthing the ground truthing shows that there's no identified habitat or species, or that it is incompatible for specific species of wildlife or aquatic habitats. And so I think that's a clear waiver, an exception, or off-ramp. And I think in all of these areas, there's an expectation and a methodology for communicating, consulting, and receiving information from federal agencies, local governments, on these different off-ramps and exceptions and waivers and variances as well. And so I do think there's a robust package of on-ramps and off-ramps that's proposed in the existing rules, with the core of the rules being that the way that we protect these species is avoidance and not mitigation or minimization. And so, and I do want to kind of clear up another thing from on Monday as well, is that, I think maybe I misspoke in what I was intending to say when it was interpreted that I think that that rules need to be changed just because our mission has changed. And I certainly don't think that that's true. I think that, the mission has changed, and a lot of the evidence that we've been presented with, the testimony that we presented with on buffers and setbacks around species, have been presented by parties that are showing evidence from different agencies that have different missions than what the COGCC has as a mission. And some of these are the BLM buffers in the resource management plans, which I think is, this is good evidence and it's good information. And some of these buffers are significantly bigger than what we're considering here. And some of the buffers are similar to what we're considering here. And some of them are more like what we had previously, which is around a 300-foot buffer in some of this stuff. But having said that, I did do a little research, and the BLM Energy and Minerals website clearly indicates that the BLM manages the federal government's onshore oil and gas program with the goals of facilitating safe and responsible energy development while providing a fair return to the American taxpayer. And that's the mission that particular buffer was developed for, in order to be able to balance things. And that the previous COGCC's mission, which created that setback that some have said that we need to maintain, is fostering the responsible and balanced development of oil and gas resources in the state of Colorado. And that's that balancing piece that created where we're at right now with setbacks. And the new COGCC mission is to regulate the development and production of the natural resources of oil and gas in a manner that protects public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources, which we all know. And so that's, for me, to clarify what I was trying to say, is that I look at these things in just a little different lens. Not that it necessarily has to change, but I just look at it through a little different lens. And certainly if I was looking at it from a BLM's perspective or from an old COGCC's perspective, I would have a different set of lenses on as well. So I feel that's like a very long-winded way of kind of getting to where I was at. But I'm certainly still open to different things, but I'm also very comfortable where we're at with the setbacks. And I'm comfortable with the on-ramps and off-ramps and variance processes that we have that are in the current drafts. And I'm really encouraging the development of the technical work group, particularly on these aquatic species, because I do think it's hard to take a statewide approach to this particular issue, and it may be more appropriate to look at it watershed by watershed or stream segment by stream segment, or whatever the appropriate tool is, because I'm making the assumption that there's certainly some areas around the state that probably need more buffer than 500 feet. And there may be areas that need less, and I think we can determine that, but I'm pretty comfortable with the cautionary principle that we're approaching this with this right now, and with the recommendations we've gotten from CPW on the 500 foot for aquatic species.
Commissioner Messner, My only point there is I don't know that's what CPW has testified to. I think CPW testified that they have data that was sufficient to establish a 300-foot setback as a minimum. And I think they also said you can go further, and 5's, good too. And so I invite CPW to come back to the fore and tell us what their testimony was, because they're the individuals that I'm listening to the most on this. They are our sister agency with the most involved in this. And I appreciate everybody else telling us their thoughts, but I really encourage CPW to tell us. Thank you for showing up, Mr. Ackerman.
Chairman,
Ms.
commissioners.
Newman,
Oh.
Ms. Holst.
Thank you, Chairman. This is Danny Newman, Land Use Specialist in the Northwest region. Your synopsis is what we testified to. 300 foot, we have a ton of literature to justify as a buffer, but literature certainly supports a range, and 500 is within that range, so it is justified as well. So yes, there's a range, and we are very comfortable with 300, and 500 is certainly appropriate in a lot of scenarios as well.
Mr. Ackerman, Mr. Holston, thank you, Ms. Newman. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, Brett Ackerman. I appreciate Ms. Newman's comments there, and she's exactly right. And I think this harkens back a little bit to my opening comments in that, admittedly, picking a statewide buffer is not the most precise way to reiterate my comments as you requested, Mr. Chair. 300 buffer or any one number is not the most precise way to manage every stream segment in Colorado, but it does take a statewide approach, and it protects this important habitat, which is imperative to protect on a gross level. As the chair pointed out, it would be less than needed in some places and likely more than needed in some places. We've tried to build into the regulations a waiver process where we do feel like it would be most frequently an exception, and that's in the ephemeral and intermittent streams. So, as I mentioned, two options. You can pick a gross number that's supported by literature and is protective under the precautionary principle and grossly protects the habitat targeted throughout the state, and that's easy to administer, easy to understand, easy to predict. Or you can look more precisely at every stream segment in Colorado and map each stream segment individually and understand what would be best for each stream segment on a case-by-case basis, which would definitely be more precise, harder to predict, harder to administer, harder to understand, and also not supported by current data that we have. And so it would be imperative to understand and undertake a process that would help us do all that mapping and help us understand what all those stream segment setbacks should be. So which could be a multi-year and potentially multi-million-dollar process. Not that it's not a good idea, but it's important that the commission's aware of that as well. So I hope that gets at the reiteration you were looking at, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Ackerman. And so if you were to, instead of mapping the whole state, take the areas in which we know there's known oil and gas development, or there's the potential for new oil and gas development, the Piceance Basin, for example, and focused your efforts there on mapping. I mean, could you bite off a little less of the apple? And again, we're the COGCC, you're CPW. We can't tell you what to do. I would, love to be able to go find you a bunch of money so that could happen. But that does seem like that more focused, in particular in the areas in which there's development, does make more sense. So that's not really a question.
I'm happy to respond, Mr. Chair, or let that sit as you would like.
Well, respond if you have anything that's responsive. Otherwise, I can turn to Mr. Gonzalez.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Only to affirm what you said. Absolutely, there are a lot of different ways to go about this, and certainly focusing on the most dense development would be the appropriate way to go about that. There are also a number of other ways. There's something called the Strawler Stream Order, and we could, base setback levels on that, and we certainly could go more into that. But we did take a look at lots of different options during the draft phase, And the reason we came back to this one was, once again, easy to understand, easy to predict, easy to administer, gross protection of habitat. But definitely other ways, if this commission directs us, that we could take a look at this issue.
But one more question, then Commissioner Gonzalez, I'll turn. So, but I did hear from you that whichever number, 300, 500, sometimes that's going to be too much, and sometimes that may be too little. And so I think what I'm hearing from you is that Commissioner McGowan's and some of the other stakeholders that have asked for a waiver process to refine it on a site-specific basis, would you be in favor of that?
We certainly would, Mr. Chair. We wouldn't object to that. And just to add to that a little bit, generally the literature sets forth a 300-foot minimum, and that's based largely on aquatic species. Outside of that, oftentimes you're protecting the upland riparian habitat that's more impacts amphibians and other terrestrial species. And so it's not that there isn't justification. That's an important point of clarification. It's just that aquatics justification generally centers around 300 feet. So that's my long answer to yes, Mr. Chair, we're comfortable with that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Commissioner Gonzalez, I'm sorry to have taken the floor for too long.
No apologies, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate the discussion. And you know, and I thought the responses by Mr. Ackerman were appropriate. You know, I think the two options, you know, we talked about were a blanket, let's do it statewide, or stream by stream. And I think what Commissioner McGowan has offered is given us the opportunity to kind of address some of that flexibility and kind of some of the concerns that I've had with this whole, you know, with this particular rule. And so I want to scrub 411 and see what that looks like. But generally, I'm supportive of a more flexible approach, as I think is pretty consistent with what I've advocated for throughout the rulemaking. Some of the particular concerns that I think, or that I have that could be addressed through kind of an intermediate buffer zone application is with the variance, right? We talked about the two components of the variance being the inability to make a showing of cannot comply or good faith to comply, and an inability of making a showing of undue hardship. If we allowed a limited application in an intermediate zone for not going through and potentially reducing the effective application of the variance process or confusing the variance process, I think that's an appropriate approach. Additionally, and as I've talked about a number of times, you know, I put a lot of stake in the sideboards of the regulations that we're creating, and those being the reasonable and necessary standard. And I think you got to think about those in order of necessary first, then reasonable second. And I don't know what's necessary. You know, we've heard a lot of testimony, different numbers, different ranges. And from what I've understood is that the 300 foot is necessary, and that 500 foot may be preferential, and bigger may be preferential in other instances. And so I think that, you know, while there's arguments for the benefits of greater distances and specifically the application of the precautionary approach, I don't know that I've heard any proof or any real testimony to the necessity of going beyond 300 feet. That being said, as I've mentioned, I was persuaded by the testimony about riverscapes from Ms. Burke. And I think it's appropriate that, you know, that's captured. I think that would be captured in kind of that intermediate zone. So that's kind of another reason why I would support a hard 300, and anything that would be within 300 would definitely have to go through a variance with undue hardship. And I think that'd be a pretty hard hurdle to get past us as a commission. But I think that when there's circumstances that allow for an appropriate siting with appropriate protections, that meet our mission, that we should consider those, and that it should not be in an arduous and potentially an inappropriate forum through a variance process. And so, you know, again, I've kind of gone back and forth in this whole discussion on 1202C, but I really appreciate kind of this hybrid approach idea, something that I, you know, hadn't exactly thought about it because I've been kind of stuck with the concerns that I've had in regard to what is a variance, how does a variance work, what is a waiver, how does a waiver work. So that's kind of my 2 cents on the matter. I'm supportive of exploring an intermediate zone with a 300-foot hard buffer, and then additional protections, additional scrutiny, 300 to 500.
Thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez. Did Director Murphy, you look like you're stepping up, or Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to clarify for myself, the 500-foot buffer is a pretty hard buffer for me in the gold medal and the cutthroat. Just for me personally, but.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I would agree. I think what I had sort of offered up the other day was to leave the cutthroat as is, but to make, to allow for the potential for an exception for the R&S species or the R&S categorizations and NSO of 300 feet. And I think I would also, I guess, be comfortable with the draft as it's proposed with the variance process with a, if a variance is sought, you know, no less than 300 feet. And my thought there is that, you know, these are, again, these are sensitive habitats, you know, we've all talked about it, but also, you know, some of those instances where those buffers maybe don't necessarily need to be 500 feet, there are these different species that may be occupying certain stretches that go beyond just the stream channel. And so there's the sort of overall, you know, value of the habitat beyond, you know, just beyond the stream itself. And so, yeah, so I think I'll leave it at that. I'm open to what Commissioner McGowan has proposed, especially with that idea of looking at having similar guidance for what we've got in 411 for the intermediate buffer zone to apply in that 300 to 500 zone. But I would equally be okay with the current draft, but with a hard NSO of 300 if a variance is requested. And I guess in that, so what I'm saying there is that if, you know, if there was any instance of seeking a variance that would go less than 300, I think that's just where the denial comes in, because these are these important habitats. And the one other comment I'll just make is, I think it was Dr. Arnett had mentioned that, you know, over time, as we have more development pressure and as the population in Colorado grows, these areas are going to get more and more pressure from all sorts of other types of development. And so the more that we can, you know, maintain that kind of protection around these important habitats, I think it's going to be really important, especially for the aquatics that are already just more under threat from a variety of reasons. So that's where I stand.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got a question for you, Mr. Chair, and for Commissioner McGowan, just in regards to the idea that was supposed. Is why should cutthroat be treated differently than the other aquatic species? I understand the gold medal waters part, but the cutthroat part, not quite sure. That I personally have heard testimony that it deserves more protection than other aquatic species, and so I'm curious why that 300 may not be appropriate in that regard as well.
Commissioner McGowan. I'm also
Thank you,
happy to talk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, you go first, and maybe Commissioner Nanjapa can help me out here too a little bit as we have this discussion.
Yeah, and I guess Bill, just as I see it, that's the high waters. That's the origination waters. That's where you find the cutthroats, and those are some of our most pristine riparian areas. And so that's where I tend to think that makes more sense. I'll be honest with you though. I'm struggling. I'm hearing from others that because of that, that's the narrowest corridors, and that may, you know, just undo an ability to be able to do anything, or it's always going to be a variance for that. You know, so that's sort of my initial thoughts on that. Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, and I don't know if Commissioner McGowan wanted to jump in further on that, but I didn't want to, okay. She's saying, go ahead. I think for me, it was more about the cutthroat habitat is that the headwater streams, as you just mentioned, Chair Robbins, and, there's a lot of other value of that habitat, that those headwaters in general, that go beyond, the fishery per se. I think also, cutthroat are our native species when we're talking about some of the sport fish management waters and others. While these are, economically important, for the state in terms of our angling community, they're not native fish by and large. And so I think that it does make some sense to protect our native species here in Colorado.
Commissioner Gonzalez, one other point I would make is, I've tried to be responsive to the West Slope is different, and listening to that group, and that group too did not have an objection to 500 for cutthroat trout. And that was something that I listened to. So I add that onto the fact that that's our headwater streams, which gets me very comfortable with that distance for those types of streams.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and Commissioner Nanjapa. I appreciate the perspective there. And since we're talking about it now, I'm sure we'll hear more about it tomorrow afternoon as well. So thanks.
If I may interject.
Please, your interjections are always helpful to 5 scatterwide commissioners.
Well, I think that we're having a really, really intriguing, diverse conversation. But functionally, what I think this commission needs to decide is for each of the aquatic habitat, and I've tried to put it on the screen. I've been trying to work through it as I've listened to each of you. For each of the aquatic habitats, for me, there are 4 on the table for discussion. What is the NSO, right? Is there a buffer zone? Question 2. Sorry. Question 3 is, are we going to rely on the general 1202C variance process using 502 or something else? And I recognize for 2 of the habitats, there is already a built-in waiver process for intermittent ephemeral streams. And so I wanted to try to find a way to work through the specific issues. And I'm not suggesting that we need to work through them today, but I'd rather give us each a framework through which we can answer individual questions to get to clear direction to staff around what the rules need to say at the end of the day, or at least a clear way to come to a decision by this commission.
Thank you, Director Murphy. Thank you for your wonderful patience as you work from home with kids and dogs. You do an amazing job. And I appreciate this sort of reframing. I'm trying to figure out if we do want to try to go through this, or if we want to leave this. So we've got this framed, and we have the sort of options A, B, C, and Commissioner McGowan's D. And maybe from my perspective, and I'm just shooting from the hip here, I'd kind of like to have these 2 slides and give them out to the parties and let them talk to us about it tomorrow, before we refine in on what the position may be. I think we can very easily on Friday do for the first time something we've not done before, which is craft on the fly a little bit, knowing that Friday is our end date. So that's my musings on what next steps should be. What do other commissioners think? Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I like the idea of maybe kind of more clearly laying this out in these couple slides and then letting the parties react to this. I think this is kind of the gist of where I was thinking, we wanted to get is something a little bit more narrow and specific that we could get, reaction to, and the pros and cons in the closing and the reactions tomorrow. But yeah, I think we've had some good discussion. We have some good options on the table that now it's just important to hear from what the stakeholders feel about them.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur with saying this to the parties, and we'll hear from them tomorrow afternoon. And with that, again, as we have done in the past, and as you did, Mr. Chair, on Monday, is encourage consensus, right? If there's any way that we can find some workable room in what we've discussed today, that's going to be helpful to us in our deliberations.
Giving Director Murphy a chance to get her slide finished up here.
So fortunately or unfortunately, because I was thinking so hard about what words to type while 114 people watch me, I might have missed some of the dialogue there, but I do think that this frames the four questions the three questions that need to be answered for each of the habitats. As we think about this, there is an issue that gets interrelated and intermixed with this conversation very frequently, and that is the general process for for deviating from the other 1202C habitats. Should it be a variance? Should it be an exception? And so my suggestion to you, commissioners, is when we get to take this up, is first decide that bigger picture question for 1202C. And again, staff strongly supports a variance process. And once that's decided, it makes deciding this third question for the specific aquatic buffers simpler, because you know what you're comparing to. But I've just heard so much intermeshing of those two issues from staff, from parties, from everybody, that I want to kind of suggest that you take that up first. The other point is, if you want me to put together a slide that more correctly lays out options A, B, C, and D, or A, B, C1, C2, I'm going to need help, and I would need to go back to the first slide that I put together to lay that out, if that would be helpful for you, or if you think it would be helpful for the party. So I await your direction.
So, Director Murphy, on this slide, I think subparagraph 3, as drafted, it just speaks to variance. And I think I would be more comfortable if you said, after the question mark, or should a waiver be, or is it a waiver, or something like that. Just that way we know both options remain on the table, because I think they both still are. Yeah, and it could be different depending upon the habitat. Commissioner Messner, please.
So just a point of clarification, because I think what I heard Director Murphy say, I think a lot of the debate that we're having right now is around aquatic habitat and whether or not there should be, and I think Commissioner McGowan's proposal is specific to aquatic habitat and not all the other species that are included in 1202C. And so if we're having a conversation about whether or not to have a variance process for any NSO for any of these species, then to me that's a very different conversation than whether or not we're having a discussion about whether or not to have a variance or a waiver for the aquatic species. So I guess I'm just not sure what we're talking about.
And I think that I think that we are speaking to the QRNS, or whatever the three are, with regard to this discussion. I think that the variance process is already defined out for all of the other critters in 1202C. You always got that option if you want to try for it. But I think what I heard a lot of the testimony around was with regard to the aquatics, building in flexibility, because as we heard from Mr. Ackerman, 3's likely the minimum. Sometimes you can be less, sometimes you can be more. And so what I at least was thinking is that this exception variance piece is tailored to the aquatics, because of the testimony that I heard from CPW, that it's hard to have a blanket rule and always be right. Commissioner Messner.
And I appreciate that. And I'm fine with leaving it where it is here and considering different things. I mean, I think these bullets already fall in line with what the party presentations have already presented as far as different options for this particular thing. So I'm not sure we're going to hear anything significantly different from the parties than what they already presented on these different options anyway. And so I'm always open to hearing things. I'm not sure, whether that's going to be any different or not, but yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
I appreciate those comments, Commissioner Messner. Other commissioners with comments? Director Murphy, would you like us to help you flesh out A, B, and C1, C2, or do commissioners want to do that? So yeah, I think, Commissioner Nanjava, you raised your hand. Did you have a comment before we perhaps engage in on this slide?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure what the best way to go about skinning this cat is, but I'm thinking the one thing I just was going to say is in that last slide with the different questions. I think one of the questions we heard a lot, as was said, from stakeholders, especially around RNS and not as much about Q, which is the cutthroat trout. And so I guess one question is just, is it all three or is it just one just RNS with respect to any alteration? But I would also agree that we're not really talking about, by and large, A through P, whatever comes through before Q. Yeah. So we're generally talking about, just Q, R, and S, I think, unless my fellow commissioners disagree. And then the more narrow question is, is it all three or just those two?
Yeah, and I think too, we also have put on the table a gold medal okay, Commissioner McGowan.
What I was going to say is that we might be tweaking QRS depending on what we do to reflect gold medal because it's not really categorized yet.
Commissioner Messner.
Well, and I think, thank you. And I think just to put a little finer tooth comb on this is that one of the things needs to be considered is that there is already off-ramps for intermittent and ephemeral streams. And if we are going to have a waiver process, then do we need to eliminate that waiver process or modify that waiver process for ephemeral and intermittent streams if we're going to have more of a broad overarching waiver process? And so I think that has to be part of the consideration here.
Okay. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you. I've got kind of one thought, but I don't really have a lot of discussion behind it. But one of the other requests that we received from parties about, or one of the other needs that was demonstrated from parties about waivers is kind of the effective buffer or the effective habitat that's used around certain species where the topography or the existing landscape or use or whatever essentially eliminates that species from being able to use the entire buffer zone. And so that was kind of a concern that if that still went through a variance process, it would still have those two showing element concerns that I've raised in the in kind of the 1 and the 3 of those 5 elements under 502 whatever, I don't recall what they were. But anyways, that'd be a concern that I still would have moving forward through that variance process, and I think it should have some discussion at some point, at least on Friday, or some perhaps some additional language in the SBP on how those two elements would be evaluated and applied.
Commissioner Messner.
I appreciate that, Commissioner Gonzalez. I do think, though, that 1202C by way of 309E36, which does give CPW the ability to determine that there's no identified habitat or species, or that it's incompatible for specific species of wildlife habitat, would already create an exception for that particular situation, would it not?
Commissioner Gonzalez.
I think that'd be a question for staff. I don't know if it would or it wouldn't, and that's kind of a concern I had. Does it have to be that that species doesn't exist within the buffer, or does that rule allow for an adjustment of the buffer? So I understand what you're saying, Commissioner Messner, but I do not know the answer to that question. I would look to staff for a little more color on that.
Director Murphy.
Yeah, Greg, sorry, Mr. Duranlo, if you have an answer, go for it. I was trying to digest it and look at rules and might have gotten lost.
Thank you. And I think maybe clarification from Commissioner Gonzalez would be helpful. Is your question pertaining to a variance process on the aquatic species buffers or for all species under 1202C?
It's for all species under 1202C, and you know, some of the specific examples we had were a species on top of a plateau. That plateau isn't, you know, the full radius or the full diameter, should I say, of the buffer, where it's not effective for that species to use that entire buffer. In that case, would the exception under 309E that would allow CPW to say that habitat doesn't exist in that location apply to that type of scenario?
Yes, I think the 309 provision could look at the, you know, if the species are up on the plateau and the proposal is down, you know, below the cliffs, and the species and habitat do not reside there, I think that's an appropriate use of the 309 EC3. The species and habitat do not live here.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you. How would an operator go about obtaining that determination and then moving forward with an OGDP within a buffer zone?
Mr. Drawling.
So they would identify that this is where they want to apply for their location or their oil and gas development plan with the location in that spot. And they would need written concurrence from CPW that in fact, the species and habitat do not reside down here in the valley bottom, but they reside up on the top of the cliff. And so they could achieve that in the pre-consultation with CPW and present that concurrence as part of their application, or they could address it, they could just submit their application and say they're not requesting a variance because the species and habitat aren't there, and we could resolve it in the technical consultation once the permit is already in process and under review.
Thank you. And just to be clear, so during that technical consultation, I guess, so they would have written concurrence from CPW, staff would concur, and then staff would recommend it for approval. It goes on the consent agenda if that's appropriate, and is approved that way, in which case the buffer just wouldn't apply. So they're in the buffer, but but they're carved out through that 309E, which is part of the staff's determination in the OGDP review.
Correct.
Thank you.
Commissioner Messner, did I see your hand go up or no? Okay. Director Murphy, where are we?
Letting my dog out and then suggesting that I think that we've had a lot of dialogue on these different points. If we want to let everybody retreat and think about it, that's great. Also, if we want to help me refine A, B, and C, or C1 or C2, that's fine. I don't feel terribly obligated to do that.
Let's do this. Let's take 10 minutes. We've been going at it for over 2 hours, and then come back and perhaps refine A, B, C1, and C2, and then have a discussion on the around the compensatory mitigation, which I think we had identified as our third topic. And then at that point, we could possibly break and look to give our stakeholders, you know, a little less than 24 hours to put their thoughts together to provide us closings tomorrow. Does that work for folks? All right, let's return at 4 4:47, 11 minutes. Team, hello stakeholders. This is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. We are back at it this afternoon on the work we're doing here. Director Murphy, I think we were gonna chat with, oh look, you've not made a nice little table and put color into your slides. Excellent.
One in a row. This is a matrix to me, or a table, and it's the only time I think about in rows and columns, but I think this makes it kind of easy to fill in, and maybe we can play like aquatic species bingo or something with it. Not really, that's a terrible joke. But I do think it really helps us frame out what the questions are and how we need to think about answering them. The other piece that I took care of on the break is to try to add language that we think would clarify in the SPP to address the concerns that Commissioner Gonzalez and Mesner were talking about specifically. In that, what does 309E3C mean if a species or habitat is no longer present for purposes of Rule 1202? And so I think this is a good clarification and represents the dialogue we've just had. So I wanted to go ahead and write that out.
You were much more productive during your break than I. Thank you for that.
Sure.
With that, do you want to roll back up? Yeah, there we go. And so A, staff October 9th proposal, which is, basically the 500. B is the proposal I've put on the table a couple of times for talking. And then C, maybe we could allow Commissioner McGowan to flesh out for us her idea of C1 and C2. Put you on the spot there, Commissioner McGowan, sorry.
Calling it C1 and C2. Am I divvying up my proposal into two?
Well, I think we had a C, and I think you made a C1. Maybe
Oh,
that's
yes. Okay. So I just was, okay. So I think you had it before, Director Murphy, pretty accurately, which was the buffers are still 500 feet with the ability to request a waiver, except gold medal and trout would be a hard 500. You can go variance route if you want to be within 300 feet for those two. Between 300 and 500 is a waiver, but you have to apply the 411 intermediate buffer BMPs. And then you've got that other part there. If there's a special circumstance, CPW can recommend more conditions of approval or deny.
Commissioner McGowan, can I ask a follow-up question?
Mm-hmm.
So when you say CPW can waive,
recommend, they can recommend, sorry. So I think even when we have the waiver process in other parts of our rules, it's a recommendation, right? And it still goes to the commission as part of the full permit, right?
Director Murphy?
Can I say kind of, in that with waivers, we have empowered somebody to say that this provision does not need to apply. Yes, the commission has the ultimate authority to continue to deny or to override that waiver, I think. I mean, that's a really good question for Kyle and probably not for me. But when I think about how we're reviewing a permit, if we've included a waiver provision and the person who has the person or entity that has the authority to waive waives it, we've deemed that as compliance and wouldn't continue to revisit that issue, recognizing you commissioners have plenary authority, or whatever the right legal word is.
Mr. Davenport, did you want to weigh in?
I don't think I need to weigh in. I think Director Murphy summed that up nicely. The important point here, again, is that in many of our rules, we've given people the ability to waive, and I don't believe the commission couldn't really say, we reject your waiver. We're not allowing you to waive that. The commission could still choose, nevertheless, to deny an OGDP, even though there was a waiver. But that's kind of the
do this two at the same time.
Commissioner Najapa and then Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, you know, I know we've really beat this horse a lot, but I just wanted to confirm in the event of a waiver or exception, what we're saying is that CPW is basically giving confirmation or denial that the operator can be sufficiently protective with COAs or whatever. That would be the waiver scenario, but the variance scenario means the operator has to show us why they need to seek a different distance and what they will do. Is that mostly accurate?
Director Murphy.
I'm so sorry. I couldn't type and think. So Commissioner Najapa, would you be gracious enough to reframe your question or restate it?
Sure. Thank you, Director Murphy. And, you know, I don't know if AG Davenport, you know, could chime in, but I was just trying to, again, make sure that we were clear on the difference between the waiver scenario versus the variance. And especially as it, you know, I know that Commissioner Messner brought up some good points and you all, staff and CPW did about sort of where the burden lies. So in the waiver process, what we're saying is that what that means is that CPW has to come in and either give confirmation or denial that the operator can be sufficiently protective, perhaps with the addition of COAs or whatever. Whereas the variance means that the operator has to come to us and demonstrate why they need to seek a different approach and maybe also what they would agree to do. Or do we, can you just clarify for me on that?
I think that's fair in that by authorizing the waiver, we're authorizing CPW to make that determination. In contrast, with a variance, we would be expecting the operator to come to you and demonstrate why it's appropriate to site within an NSO for any number of reasons, whether they're wildlife specific or not. AG Davenport, do you want to add to that?
Sure. I don't think I have much to add. Though I think Commissioner Najapa, you have pretty accurately summarized kind of the differences. I mean, I think for a CPW waiver, there are protections potentially being waived as a result of that waiver that would normally apply. And that would depend on CPW and also commission staffs and the director's analysis of whether a waiver would be appropriate in that case. For a variance, there is, in my view, kind of potentially a broader suite of remedies available in the sense that the operator, right now under the current variance rule, the operator needs to show a variety of things. One of those things in subpart 502C5 is that based on conditions of approval, that is sufficiently protective. So potentially the variance discussion is a much larger conversation about what kind of conditions of approval could we put on this, and if you were going to need a variance from an NSO in 1202C, for example. I do think it's also important to point out that in the variance context, that is always in the context of the rule that the operator is requesting a variance for. So a variance discussion from one rule, like 1202C, would be very different from a variance conversation from a different rule. on a noise standard or something like that.
Thank you, AAG Davenport. I think that's helpful, and I think so. What we're saying in this instance is that with 1202C, because we're talking specifically about these distances, that would be the specificity of the variance being requested would be a different distance. But as you pointed out, then with 502C, there would be conditions of approval that would be discussed. So actually, I guess in either instance, there could be conditions of approval in either a waiver or a variance. But you were saying that the waiver could potentially waive that provision altogether. Is that correct?
Well, not necessarily, and I did see some brows furrow on that too. So maybe it's perhaps good to talk about a specific rule, Commissioner Najapa. Which waiver are we talking about?
Well, I think the one that we're contemplating, which is, whether or not there should be some sort of waiver option that would allow for, something less than 500 feet in these aquatic buffers. So for 1202C1, QRNS, or at least RNS. And so, yeah, so I guess I'm just wanting to, I think what I'm hearing is that in the waiver scenario, CPW is providing essentially a recommendation to us that either confirms or denies that there is sufficient reason that we can differ from the rule because it's sufficiently protective in their expert opinion. Whereas in the variance, the operator is making a case to us as to whether they can be sufficiently protective, and we could still impose additional conditions of approval if we were going to grant it. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And I would hope I'm not going too far down a limb, and the director will correct me if she's seeing something different. But I think in the context of a waiver discussion, as you've already said, Commissioner Najapa, there could be more discussions about conditions of approval or something else there as well. That does not, allowing a waiver does not mean that you are limiting the director and staff and CPW to just basically give a thumbs up or a thumbs down to the waiver with no additional options for discussion. And I do want to point out again that whether or not CPW grants a waiver, the commission can still, the way our procedural rules are set up in 500, say, we don't understand this waiver, or something more needs to happen here. So there is no guarantee for an operator, whether it's a variance or a waiver, until the commission issues a final decision on an OGDP application.
Thank you, Mr. Davenport. Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that discussion. And just to make sure that I understand, in a waiver scenario, burden of proof's on CPW. In a variance procedure, the burden of proof is on the operator. No, not necessarily.
Director Murphy?
Sure, thank you. Commissioner Messner, we've talked about it in kind of those words, but I would frame it a little bit differently. It's more that through these rules, we have decided that CPW has the expertise in this instance, right? In any place we have a waiver, that someone who is going to be impacted has the ability to waive the protections of the rule, right? And so to me, it's kind of like allowing CPW to exercise some discretion in that space, right? In contrast, a variance says, operator, you can make your case to whoever the impacted folks are, in this case CPW, and explain why this is the best outcome. And those impacted that impacted person, entity, wildlife has the ability to provide a recommendation into the overall OGDB process, but it's ultimately a commission level decision. And so, and I want to say that, you know, anytime there is a proposal for an oil and gas development plan, an oil and gas proposed location, operator does have the burden of proof generally. But when we get into some of these instances of waivers, we've looked at the situation and we think in certain instances, the impacted person has the ability to waive the protections. Does that help a little bit? Or have I further muddied waters?
Commissioner Messner?
No, I appreciate that. I understand what the implications are, and there are two different implications in this scenario between a variance and a waiver. So thank you for that. I did have one clarification as well, and this is clear to me. So just a note from me that these three are clear to me now as far as what we're considering here. But the specificity as far as an aquatic native, I know that there's some aquatic natives that are listed species, razorback, sucker, bony-tailed chub, pike minnow. I don't know how this plays into that. And so I was just kind of curious about that.
I would have to phone a friend on that one, because I can kind of keep our rules straight, but in terms of how we're protecting different species, I'd hope maybe either Mr. Ackerman, Ms. Newman could chime in.
Mr. Ackerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Murphy. The question, as I understand it, was where do species like pike minnow and other native species fit into? Is that correct?
Yeah, just whether those are considered aquatic natives or whether they're in a separate category.
No, you're right on, Commissioner Messner. So those species, you know, the humpback chub and other recoverable species that have existed here fall within the native species group.
So they wouldn't warrant additional protection as an endangered species necessarily?
Mr. Ackerman?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Messner. Thank you for the clarifying point. Yes, absolutely. Each one of those that is deemed a threatened or endangered species would also fall under the protective restrictions of the Endangered Species Act and also of your regulations here. And certainly their range does intermingle with other native species.
Okay,
But
thank you.
just to clarify, I don't think that this is what's out there, but I wanted to clarify that clearly all native species are not threatened and endangered, but there are a subset of those that are.
Commissioner Najapa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, this is Mr. Ackerman. Don't go away. This is for you as well. Just a clarification there too. It's similar to what we were talking about with critical habitat, where it's not, you know, part of the immediate requirement to designate with T&E species. I was just thinking that there are, you know, habitat conservation plans or species conservation plans that, you know, can be created, but again, are not necessarily required. To your knowledge, do any of those have specific buffer distances already specified for some of those species?
Mr. Ackerman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Nanjapa, you're talking about species that have been listed under the Endangered Species Act and for which critical habitat has been designated?
No, I was saying similar to how critical habitat is not necessarily designated immediately. There's also sort of species conservation plans and habitat conservation plans and those kinds of things that go along with them. But they're, or sorry, I may be confusing. I think a habitat conservation plan may be more related to incidental take, I think. But there are, you know, species conservation plans that come into play that are not necessarily required, but kind of become the standard for certain, for species recovery plans. I think that's, sorry, I'm not coming up with the right term. So yeah, with the recovery plans that we have for any of these native species, are there buffer distances specified for those?
Thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa. Yes, and thanks for the clarification. And so there are a number of recovery plans and species-specific plans, as Commissioner Nanjapa has talked about here. And within those plans, generally what we do is we do map habitat. Most often when we put together a conservation plan, we map occupied habitat, we map potential habitat. I do want to make a distinction, though, that generally those are informational, whereas for threatened and endangered species, map critical habitat has regulatory implications. So in these plans, we'll map habitat, we'll map strategies and best management practices for recovery of species. And in some cases, that could recommend buffer zones, as certainly would for some species, but not of necessity for all species, depending on the level of threat, depending on the abundance of habitat and the adherence to a specific life cycle function that would be dictated by a specific type of habitat, if that's not too convoluted of an answer, Commissioner.
No, thank you. That's helpful. And I guess as I'm kind of thinking through this too, it's usually related more specifically to the threats that are known, that are more direct contributors to the decline, and so yeah, so that can vary quite a bit. I was just kind of curious if how much that came into play, or if there was information out there in recovery plans that that we could look at in this vein. But I think I've got what I need in terms of just kind of thinking through that issue. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Can I make one clarification there, Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Ackerman.
I just want to clarify that generally buffers, in the sense that we're talking about here today, hard and fast buffers, aren't often a component of a species-specific recovery plan. Certainly they could be, but they couldn't really be ubiquitously relied upon to inform a regulatory requirement like this.
Thank you. Other thoughts, questions, comments from commissioners or Director Murphy relative to the slide that we have now built up? All right. With that being the case, I think we can turn to compensatory mitigation. And I think we were going to try to provide a little more direction to staff of the options. Who would like to lead into this discussion? Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm trying to remember all the slides, but if we stick to the flat fee per site, I think I would prefer that the area that had been excluded in trying to figure out the average cost for a project includes Pitkin County. I was worried it was going to add a significant amount, and if I remember correctly, it wasn't too much.
Commissioner McGowan, or Commissioners, I've imported the slides from staff's presentation today into this PowerPoint so we can refer back and forth between them and be refreshed on what the numbers are, if that's helpful.
So Director Murphy, I think the next one is the option that includes Pitkin, I think.
There are a couple.
So from 13 to 17?
Right, one includes Pitkin for less than $1 million, or exceeding $1 million. And I don't know, I might need Mr. Holst to talk us back through it because I've deleted all those memories from earlier today.
Mr. Holst.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. So yeah, this option 2, we excluded those conservation easement values that were over $1 million an acre. Basically included them up to $1 million. And there was, not very many, but it did add the, a little bit of value there to what the average easement cost was across the state, appraisal value.
Okay, sorry. So can you go to option 3? Did that include the more than $1 million? Sorry. Okay.
So
no,
I actually, if I may, Mr. Chairman, I did not include the over $1 million. There were only two, but they were significantly over $1 million, and they actually changed the average conservation easement value across the state to over $30,000 per acre.
Okay, got it.
And they were significant outliers. And so and on none of these options do I include those two conservation easements, because they were really skewed the data significantly.
So then I have to say, I'm not sure I understand the difference between option 2 and option 3, and I might need a little reminder from you. I'm sorry.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, if I may. So option 2 uses the same methodology that we used, where we split out short-term and long-term acres. And basically, we just adjusted the long-term acres by those conservation easement appraisal values in Pitkin County that were less than $1 million. So it bumped that long-term conservation cost up a little bit, but it continued to use sort of our habitat improvement estimated cost to offset that short-term disturbance for option 2. Option 3 assumes that, you know, we're not going to distinguish between short and long-term. We're just going to basically take our original conservation easement appraisal value that was statewide, where we actually excluded all of the conservation easement values over $100,000 an acre, which were also from Pitkin County. So it lowered that long-term cost a bit, and then we just basically multiplied that by the overall average disturbance, which was 5.82 acres. So that's how we came up with that one. And I must say, even those easement values in Pitkin County that were over $100,000 an acre, those were also significant outliers. I mean, so those over 100,000 were really kind of outliers in the data set. There was, you know, I want to say like 160 plus conservation easement appraisal values over that 5-year period that we looked at. And there was a handful of them in Pitkin County that really skewed the data if we didn't eliminate them.
Mr. Chair, I'm wondering if Director Murphy if we could talk again about, there might be a double-edged sword to doing it based on acreage.
Director Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioner. I tend to think, and this is probably a good question to ask an operator tomorrow or operators tomorrow as well. I tend to think that the overarching regulatory requirements from the state, from the local, from the federal as appropriate will guide the appropriate siting of locations. I think it would require a very high compensatory mitigation fee to truly drive an unsafe sizing requirement. And so, yes, I think that having a per acre fee does encourage responsible development, but all of our rules are geared towards minimizing surface disturbance, but not at the expense of safety, right? And so I think we have the right balance there, and picking the right fee is more about picking the right fee in my estimation.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And like I indicated before, I really appreciate all the different ones. And I don't know today if I could, I mean, at this minute, if I can say one is better than the other, but I have to, just to share my opinion and my thinking right now, I really appreciate this option 3, which is the flat fee based on the average disturbance, both short and long term as one flat fee. Because I do think that conservation easements, as far as being an effective mitigation tool, may be the most beneficial utilization of these funds. And so ensuring that there is appropriate mitigation dollars in order to be able to accomplish that, should that need to be the necessary mitigation, is compelling to me. And so that's where I'm leaning right now.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and this I'm going to piggyback right on Commissioner Messner's comment. The one concern I have about a flat fee that's set at approximately 6 acres is that I think that it may unduly penalize smaller operators and operators with smaller operations, whereas those operations are not going to be quite as economic as something you might see with a horizontal operation in a bigger pad, where that fee may be a lot more nominal. It could have a lot more impact on a smaller operator if just a flat fee is applied statewide and they're drilling smaller well pads than what would be appropriate under a per acre fee. So just kind of when these are all pitched out there, that's one of the first thoughts that came to my mind is I'd be wary to penalize smaller operators, operators who are working on a smaller budget, smaller operations. I think that this would be more impactful and more burdensome to them. That being said, again, going back to kind of reasonable and necessary, I thought the basis for the mitigation fees, regardless of what the actual amount is, I thought were posed to me as being necessary, given their comps, if you will, right? Their real estate comps for how they're being calculated. And of course, I think that, pretty much any of these any of these on a per acre basis would probably be reasonable for application. I think on the necessary side of that equation, where I'm sitting today right now is in favor of the as proposed draft from staff, as proposed rule from staff.
Other questions, thoughts? We just wanted to tee this up so that folks would know what to talk about tomorrow. So Commissioner Njapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't think I know yet where I land on this, but can I look at option 4, please? Okay.
Director Murphy.
And sorry, was option 5 was just looking at all of those together? Is that right? Okay, yeah.
Option 5 is looking at all of those, but on a per acre basis.
But on a, right, okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Okay, other thoughts, comments, questions, considerations for this afternoon on this topic? Director Murphy, are you good? Are we good? Is there anything else we need to talk about this afternoon? Thank you, staff, for bearing with us. Hopefully, folks were able to take good notes to know how to talk to us successfully tomorrow. That'll be great. We look forward to the closing statements.
Chair, I'll integrate these slides into staff's presentation from today and make sure that gets out to commissioners, parties in the world shortly.
Okay. And I think I saw, as we were doing this afternoon, Hearings Manager Larson, did you update our agenda for tomorrow?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I did. It does provide, some parties are reallocating time for their response statements. So the revised agenda reflects that information that I received to date. There have been a few more additions, so we can run through that tomorrow, but it does provide the allocations for party responses tomorrow. And it does also note that on Friday, the commission will be taking a final vote on the 200 through 600 series rules.
Okay, great. And then timeline wise, we're still looking for a motion to adjourn until Thursday, November 19th at 1 p.m. Is that right? Did that change?
That is still the correct time that we are coming back tomorrow at 1 p.m. Yeah.
Okay. And then for our stakeholders, 105 of you, we will hear closing statements. And as Hearings Manager Larson indicated, we will then adjourn tomorrow afternoon after closings. We'll have the evening to contemplate that. And we'll come back for deliberation on Friday morning at 9 on the 1200 series, followed by final action on the 2 through 6. So, commissioners, thank you for a good day. I think we're looking for a motion to adjourn until Thursday, November 19th at 1 p.m.
So moved.
Second.
We got a motion. We got multiple seconds. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Seeing none. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, stakeholders, for bearing with. We look forward to hearing from you tomorrow. And with that, we will leave the meeting.